Welcome, travelers. Beyond the 12 labors lies a path unwritten, where a son of Zeus steps past the edge of the map. He carries a weight heavier than the sky, searching for a glimmer of gold hidden within a garden of shadows. Tread carefully, for the world is wider than the myths suggest, and the true journey has only just begun. Chapter 1. The road to Eli's was not marked by milestones or banners, but by the heavy, suffocating scent of decay. It was a smell that sat upon the air like a physical weight, a thick, copper-tasting miasma that clung to the back of the throat and watered the eyes of even the hardiest travelers. Long before the white stone walls of King Augeas's palace shimmered in the heat of the Peloponnesian sun, the land announced its own corruption. Here walked Hercules, the son of Zeus, the lion-clad wanderer whose deeds were already beginning to echo through the valleys of Greece. He traveled alone, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the dusty path, his expression one of grim resolve rather than heroic anticipation. He had faced the Nemean lion's impenetrable hide and the Hydra's regenerating heads, but this labor, commanded by his spiteful cousin Eurystheus, was intended to break his spirit through sheer humiliation. Eli's was a paradox of a kingdom. It was wealthy beyond measure, blessed by the sun god Helios, or so the legends claimed. The pastures were lush and green, rolling out toward the horizon, but they were teeming with a chaotic, shifting sea of hide and horn. The herds of King Augeas were legendary, numbering in the thousands, bulls white as snow, cows with coats of red and gold, beasts that possessed a divine vitality that rendered them immune to sickness. They never died of illness, they rarely fell to predators, and they bred with a ferocity that defied nature. But with such abundant life came the inevitability of waste. For 30 years, the king had neglected his duties. For 30 years, the dung had fallen layer upon layer, season upon season, untouched by shovel or spade. It had risen like a slow, pestilent tide, swallowing the stone foundations of the great stables, caking the valley floor, and turning the heart of the kingdom into a festering sore. When Hercules finally stood before the gates of the palace, the flies were a dark cloud that buzzed with the sound of a distant storm. He was brought before King Augeas, a man draped in silks that were startlingly white against the backdrop of his filthy domain. The king was a man of soft hands and arrogant eyes, a ruler who measured his worth by the count of his cattle and ignored the squalor that sustained them. He looked upon the demigod not with awe, but with a sneering amusement, holding a perfumed handkerchief to his nose, as if Hercules himself were the source of the stench. So Augeas intoned, his voice dripping with languid mockery, "Eurystheus sends me the great Hercules. I expected an army, or perhaps a wizard. Instead, I see a man with a club and a lion's skin. Tell me, son of Zeus, do you intend to bludgeon the dung into submission?" Hercules stood amidst the marble columns, the stench of the stables wafting in through the open terrace. He did not rise to the bait. His eyes, sharp and calculating, looked past the king, out toward the source of the rot. He saw the vast enclosure in the valley below, a sprawling pit where the manure was piled so high it rivaled the city walls. To clear it by hand would take 1,000 men, 1,000 years. It was a task designed to be impossible, a fool's errand meant to leave him knee-deep in filth for the rest of his days. "I am not here to fight," Hercules said, his voice a low rumble that silenced the tittering courtiers. "I am here to cleanse." Augeas laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Cleanse? My stables have not seen the stone of their floors since my father's time. The filth is part of the earth now. You cannot clean it." "I can," Hercules replied, stepping closer, his presence suddenly filling the room. "And I will, not in a year, not in a month. I will clear the stables of Eli's in a single day." The court fell silent. The claim was absurd, the boast of a madman. Augeas narrowed his eyes, sensing a trap or a delusion. He looked at the vastness of his herds, then back to the lone warrior. The king's greed, always his defining trait, sparked to life. If this fool wanted to break his back for nothing, so be it. But if he failed, the humiliation would be legendary. "A single day," Augeas repeated, a cruel smile touching his lips. "And if you perform this miracle, what is the price of such labor?" "1/10," Hercules said, his voice steady as the earth. "If the stables are pure by sunset tomorrow, I take 1/10 of your herd. If I fail, you take my life and my service." The king did not hesitate. He saw the math clearly in his mind. The task was physically impossible for a mortal frame. No man could move mountains of muck in the span of 12 hours. It was free labor, a gamble he could not lose. "Agreed," Augeas declared, gesturing to his son, Hylas, to witness the pact. "By the gods, let it be written. Clean my stables by sunset, and the cattle are yours." Hercules nodded once, turning his back on the throne without a bow. He walked out of the palace, past the jeering guards and the swarming flies. He did not head toward the stables, nor did he reach for a shovel. He walked to the edge of the valley, where the roar of water echoed against the rocks. He looked to the north and the south, where the great rivers Alpheus and Peneus carved their paths through the hills. He watched the white water churn, powerful and relentless, possessing a strength no muscle could match. The hero smiled, for while the king saw only filth and coin, Hercules saw the landscape itself as a weapon. The labor would not be won with a strong back, but with the mind of a world walker who understood the flow of the earth. Chapter 2. The dawn broke over the valley of Eli's with a silent, sweltering promise of heat. The courtiers of King Augeas gathered on the high terraces, sipping wine and shielding their eyes from the glare, eager to witness the humiliation of a demigod. They expected to see Hercules knee-deep in the mire, shovel in hand, fighting a losing battle against a mountain of filth that had grown for a generation. They prepared their jests and their mocking laughter, for surely no man, not even the son of Zeus, could move such a mass of corruption before the sun dipped below the western hills. But down in the valley, Hercules did not touch the shovel. He stood before the entrance of the great enclosure, his lion's skin draped over his shoulder, and looked upon the squalor with a calm, calculating gaze. He saw the task not as a burden of labor, but as a puzzle of geography. The shovel was a tool for mortals who accepted the world as it was. Hercules was a world walker, a man who reshaped the earth to suit his will. He turned his back on the stables and walked away, ignoring the confused murmurs of the watching crowd. He marched with heavy, purposeful strides toward the high ridges that bordered the valley. There, the rivers Alpheus and Peneus roared in their beds, swollen with the meltwater of the distant mountains. These were ancient waters, cold and violent, thrashing against their banks with a fury that mirrored the hero's own hidden rage. Hercules stood upon a rocky outcrop, listening to the thunder of the currents. He saw the potential energy coiled within the rushing white water, a power far greater than the muscles of 10,000 men. With a nod to the invisible spirits of the water, Hercules descended. He did not go to the dung heaps. He went to the stone foundations of the stable walls. With his bare hands, he gripped the massive boulders of the rear fortification, stones that had been set by giants in an older age. With a grunt that shook the dust from the air, he tore them free, crumbling the mortar and creating a gaping breach at the lower end of the yard. He had created an exit. Now he needed an entrance. Hercules returned to the riverbanks. He did not dig with a spade. He struck the earth with his club and tore at the clay with hands that were as hard as iron. He carved a great trench, a deep scar in the land that ran from the churning waters of the Alpheus and the Peneus directly toward the upper walls of the stable yard. He worked with a terrifying speed, his body a blur of motion, sweat glistening on his skin like oil. The earth groaned as he redirected the natural order, bending the landscape to his design. Then, with a final, mighty blow, he broke the dam of earth that held the rivers back. The sound was not a splash, but a roar like the breaking of the sky. The two rivers, united in the channel Hercules had forged, surged forward in a frothing, unstoppable wall of water. The torrent crashed into the stables, a liquid hammer that struck with the force of a landslide. The ancient filth, the layers of decay that had sat undisturbed for 30 years, stood no chance against the wrath of the wild water. From the palace terraces, the laughter of the courtiers died in their throats. They watched in stunned silence as the brown tide swept through the valley. The rivers churned and boiled, lifting the mountains of manure and carrying them away in a rush of dark foam. The stench that had plagued the kingdom for decades was lifted on the wind and washed out to sea. In the span of a few hours, the water scoured the bedrock clean, polishing the white stones of the stable floor until they gleamed under the midday sun. When the work was done, Hercules piled the stones back to seal the breach and redirected the rivers to their ancient beds. The silence that returned to the valley was profound. The air was crisp, smelling only of wet stone and flowing water. The pestilence was gone. Hercules walked to the palace gates as the sun began its descent, his chest heaving slightly, water dripping from his beard. He stood before King Augeas, who sat upon his throne with a face pale as death. The king looked out at his pristine lands, then back at the hero who had performed the impossible. "The sun has not yet set," Hercules rumbled, his voice echoing in the marble hall. "The stables are clean. I have come for my 10th. Augeas's shock quickly curdled into malice. The king's greed was a sickness deeper than the filth of his herds. He looked at his son, Hylas, who nodded in awe of the hero's deed, but the king's heart was hardened. He saw a loophole where honor should have been. "You," Augeas scoffed, his voice trembling with false bravado. "You did nothing, barbarian. You did not shovel, you did not sweep. It was the rivers that cleansed my land, not your hand. The water did the work while you played in the mud." Hercules narrowed his eyes, the air in the room growing heavy with the threat of violence. "I guided the water. I broke the stone. The pact was that the stables would be clean. They are." "It was a trick," Augeas declared, standing and waving his hand dismissively. "A labor of wit, perhaps, but not of service. I owe you nothing. Get out of my kingdom before I have my guards cut you down." The betrayal hung in the air, sharp and bitter. Hercules looked at the king, etching the man's face into his memory. He did not draw his weapon, for his service to Eurystheus required him to endure, but the insult burned hotter than fire. He had moved the earth and tamed the waters, only to be cheated by a small man with a crown. With a low growl that sounded like a shifting tectonic plate, Hercules turned and left the hall. He had won the wager, but lost the prize. Yet, as he walked away from the city of Elys, he knew that while a king could break a promise, the gods and the rivers would remember who had wielded their power. The cleansing was finished, but the reckoning was yet to come. Chapter 3. The road from the sun-drenched plains of Elys to the high, shadowed valleys of Arcadia was a journey from the world of men into the realm of monsters. Hercules walked with the dust of the Augean Stables still fresh in his memory, the sting of King Augeas's betrayal hardening his heart. He had learned that the word of a king was brittle, easily broken by greed, but the will of the gods was a relentless weight that could not be shrugged aside. Eurystheus, his cousin and taskmaster, had heard of the cleansing of the stables, and with a sneer of dismissal, declared the labor void because Hercules had bargained for payment. There was no rest for the son of Zeus. His next command pointed him toward the gloom of the north, to the marshlands of Stymphalian. As the elevation climbed, the air grew thin and cold, stripped of the warmth of the coast. The lush oak forests of the lower slopes gave way to gnarled pines that clung to the rocky soil like desperate fingers. A silence fell over the land, a heavy, unnatural quiet that pressed against the ears. There was no chittering of squirrels, no rustle of deer in the underbrush, not even the chirp of a cricket. It was a silence that spoke of predation, of a landscape where the bottom of the food chain had been entirely devoured. Hercules crested the final ridge and looked down into the basin of Stymphalian. It was a dark wound in the earth, a vast, stagnant lake choked with reeds, and surrounded by a ring of black mud. A mist hung over the water, gray and motionless, obscuring the far shores. But it was not the water that drew the hero's eye, it was the trees. The forest bordering the lake was stripped bare, the branches white and skeletal, as if stripped by a plague of locusts. The ground was littered not with leaves, but with bones, white splinters of fox, wolf, and unfortunate travelers who had strayed too close to the water's edge. He descended carefully, his lion-skin cloak pulled tight against the damp chill. The mud sucked at his sandals, trying to hold him fast, but he moved with the relentless momentum of a glacier. As he neared the reed beds, a sound began to rise from the mist. It was not the organic call of a bird, nor the cry of a beast. It was a mechanical, grinding noise, like the sharpening of 1,000 swords against whetstones. It was a cacophony of metal on metal, a harsh, rhythmic clashing that set the teeth on edge. Then they rose. From the depths of the reeds and the twisted branches of the dead trees, the Stymphalian birds took flight. They were not creatures of flesh and blood alone, but monstrosities forged in the nightmares of Ares. Their bodies were the size of cranes, but heavy and muscular. Their beaks were not bone, but polished bronze, curved and serrated like scimitars capable of piercing a hoplite's breastplate. Their eyes glowed with a dull, malevolent red, devoid of animal instinct and filled with a supernatural hunger. But it was their wings that stopped the breath in Hercules' throat. As they beat the air, they did not rustle, they clanged. The feathers were shards of metallic alloy, sharp as razors and stiff as iron. When the flock turned in the air, the friction of their wings created a screeching roar that echoed off the valley walls. One bird was a terror, a flying spear that could skewer a man. But here, there was not one, nor 10, nor 100. There were thousands. The flock exploded from the marsh in a dense, chaotic wave, a rising tide of bronze and hate. They spiraled upward, their numbers so vast that they began to blot out the pale sun. The light in the valley dimmed, shifting from the gray of an overcast day to a terrifying, metallic twilight. Shadows lengthened and warped as the iron clouds swirled overhead, casting a moving darkness over the hero. Hercules stood his ground, his hand instinctively reaching for the great bow slung across his back. He nocked an arrow, the wood creaking under the strain of his immense strength, and loosed it into the mass. The shaft flew true, striking a bird in the breast, but the creature merely shuddered as the arrowhead glanced off its metallic plumage with a spark of flint. It fell, tumbling into the mud, but the gap it left was instantly filled by 3 more. A high-pitched, whistling sound cut through the din. Hercules raised his shield just as a rain of death descended. The birds, circling high above, shook their wings, releasing a volley of loose feathers. These were not soft down, but weighted darts of bronze. They hailed down upon the hero with the force of falling stones, burying themselves in the earth around him, shattering against the rocks, and thudding heavily into the thick leather of the Nemean lion's skin that protected his head and shoulders. He crouched beneath his shield, the metal rain hammering against it like a tempest. The sheer scale of the threat was overwhelming. How could a man fight a storm? To swing his club was to strike at smoke. To fire arrows was to try and drain the ocean with a spoon. The birds were not merely an enemy, they were a force of nature, an airborne plague that occupied every inch of the sky. The noise was deafening, a mixture of screeching metal and the thunder of thousands of wings. The smell of the marsh, rotting vegetation, and old blood mixed with the sharp tang of copper and rust. Hercules looked up through the slit of his visor, watching the swirling vortex of death. The birds blocked out the heavens, turning the day into a prison of iron shadows. They circled and waited, intelligent and cruel, knowing that no prey could hide forever in the open mud. For the first time since the Hydra, Hercules felt the cold touch of tactical disadvantage. Strength was useless here. A single man, no matter how mighty, could not wrestle a cloud. He needed something else. He needed a way to break the sky apart, to shatter the unity of the flock that turned them into an invincible legion. As the bronze feathers continued to fall, sticking into the mud like a crop of deadly grain, the World Walker knew that this battle would not be won with muscle, but with sound and fury. He remained crouched in the gloom of the iron twilight, his mind racing as the metallic shrieks of the Stymphalian birds proclaimed their dominion over the air. Chapter 4. The mud of Stymphalos was a graveyard of silence, broken only by the incessant, rhythmic thudding of bronze feathers striking the Nemean lion's skin. Hercules crouched beneath the golden pelt, his body curled into a tight knot of frustration. For the first time in his labors, his immense strength was not an asset, it was a redundancy. He could shatter mountains and strangle lions, but he could not punch the mist, and he could not wrestle a swarm that numbered in the thousands. The air was thick with the smell of wet iron and stale blood, a suffocating atmosphere that seemed to press the very life from his lungs. The birds circled above, a swirling vortex of metallic malice, waiting for the hero to expose a single inch of flesh. In the gloom of that iron twilight, a different light began to bleed into the world. It was not the warmth of the sun, nor the harsh glare of fire, but a cool, gray luminosity that seemed to sharpen the edges of reality. It was the light of reason, piercing the fog of panic. Hercules looked up, not with fear, but with the sudden, instinctive recognition of a divine presence. Standing upon a moss-slicked boulder near the edge of the marsh was a woman of towering stature, clad in armor that gleamed with an inner radiance. She bore no weapon, but her eyes held the weight of infinite strategy. It was Athena, the gray-eyed one, the patroness of heroes and the goddess of wisdom. She did not speak, for the roar of the birds would have drowned out any mortal words. Instead, she extended her hand. In her palm lay 2 objects of dull, heavy bronze. They were crotala great castanets, forged not by human smiths, but by the crippled god Hephaestus in the fires of Mount Olympus. They were ugly things, brutal and functional, etched with geometric sigils that hummed with a latent, vibrational power. Athena tossed them to the hero. They landed in the mud with a heavy thud, sinking slightly. By the time Hercules reached out to grasp them, the goddess had vanished, leaving only the cool clarity of her intent behind. Hercules rose to his full height, ignoring the stray darts that pinged harmlessly off his lion helm. He held the crotala in his massive hands, feeling the density of the divine metal. They were heavy, balanced perfectly for a grip that could crush stone. He understood the strategy instantly. The birds were creatures of instinct, bound by the hive mind of the flock. To defeat them, he did not need to kill them all at once. He needed to break their unity. He climbed to the highest promontory overlooking the lake, a jagged finger of rock that jutted out into the mist. He raised his arms, took a deep breath of the foul air, and struck the bronze plates together. Clack. The sound was not merely loud, it was absolute. It was a sonic shockwave, a grinding, shrieking dissonance that tore through the heavy air like a physical blade. It was the sound of the earth cracking, of metal shearing against metal, amplified by the magic of the smith god, until it resonated in the very marrow of the bones. Clack, crack. Hercules struck a rhythm, a thunderous, rolling cadence that assaulted the senses. The effect on the Stymphalian birds was catastrophic. The sound waves hit them with the force of a gale. Their sensitive hearing, tuned for the silent hunt, was overwhelmed by the divine cacophony. The flock, once a disciplined cloud of death, shattered into chaos. Screeching in pain, the birds broke formation, their metallic wings clashing against one another as they desperately sought to escape the noise. They surged upward, driven from the cover of the mist and the trees, forced into the open sky where the air was thin and the sound was less intense. The iron cloud dispersed, revealing the pale, frightened sun. The birds were no longer a single entity. They were thousands of individual targets, panicked and exposed against the blue canvas of the heavens. Hercules dropped the crotala, letting them hang by their leather thongs from his belt. In a fluid motion, he unslung the great bow of yew wood. He drew an arrow from his quiver, its tip stained dark with the venom of the hydra. His eyes, narrowed against the glare, tracked the erratic flight paths of the monsters. The archer's trance took him. He did not aim, he simply saw the future path of the target and released the string. Thrum. An arrow whistled through the air, finding the soft gap in a bird's bronze plumage. The creature plummeted, turning to stone as the poison stopped its heart before it hit the water. Thrum, thrum, thrum. His hands moved with a blur of speed, a machine of destruction fueled by discipline. Birds fell like hail, splashing into the dark waters of the lake, their metal feathers sinking into the muck. The sky rained monsters. Those that survived the initial volley shrieked in terror, their will to fight completely broken by the combination of the unbearable noise and the lethal precision of the archer below. They turned their beaks toward the east, fleeing toward the island of Ares in the distant Black Sea, abandoning the marsh that had been their kingdom. As the last of the flock disappeared over the horizon, a profound silence returned to Stymphalos. It was not the silence of predation, but of peace. The sun broke fully through the clouds, warming the heroes back. Hercules lowered his bow, his chest heaving, the sweat cooling on his brow. He looked at the crotala at his waist, then to the clear sky. Wisdom had done what strength could not. He retrieved his arrows from the mud where he could, turned his back on the carnage, and began the long walk south. The air was clean again, and the world walker had another path to tread. Chapter 5. The Aegean Sea stretched out like a sheet of hammered bronze under the midday sun. The rhythmic slap of the waves against the hull serving as the only clock for the journey. Hercules stood at the prow of the merchant vessel, his gaze fixed on the southern horizon where the island of Crete rose from the depths. This was not the rugged, pine-choked wilderness of Arcadia, nor the dusty plains of Elys. This was the cradle of a civilization that viewed itself as older and wiser than the mainland Greeks. It was a land of saffron gatherers, of painted palaces, and of kings who spoke directly to the gods of the deep. When the ship docked at the bustling port of Amnisos, the air was sweet with the scent of lilies and roasting octopus. The people here moved with a grace that seemed foreign to the rough-hewn hero. They wore linen dyed in vibrant hues of azure and ochre, and their skin was bronzed by a sun that seemed to shine brighter here than anywhere else. Yet, beneath the veneer of sophisticated tranquility, there was a tremor of fear. The laughter in the marketplace was brittle, and eyes darted toward the interior of the island, toward the verdant hills that rolled like waves of green earth. Hercules was escorted inland, following a paved road that wound through olive groves and vineyards. But as he drew closer to the great palace of Knossos, the scenery changed. The order of the fields gave way to absolute chaos. Ancient olive trees, twisted by centuries of growth, had been uprooted and snapped like dry twigs. Stone walls lay in ruin, scattered as if by the hand of a petulant giant. The vineyards, usually heavy with the dark, sweet grapes of Crete, were trampled into a purple mire, the vines torn from their trellises and ground into the dust. The palace of Minos rose from the devastation like a jewel amidst a shipwreck. It was a labyrinth of red columns and multi-storied terraces, a marvel of engineering that defied the simple architecture of the mainland. Inside, the walls were alive with frescoes, dolphins leaping in suspended animation, ladies in blue staring with serene eyes, and everywhere, the image of the bull. The bull was the sacred icon of Crete, the symbol of power and virility, worshipped in stone and paint. King Minos awaited the hero in the throne room, a space of cool shadows and alabaster floors. The king was a man of sharp intellect and heavy burdens, his brow furrowed with the weight of a divine mistake. He did not look like a tyrant, but like a man who had gambled with a god and lost. "You see my shame, son of Zeus," Minos said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. He gestured to the open balcony that overlooked the ruined lands. "Poseidon sent me a sign of his favor, a bull of such perfection that it seemed carved from the sea foam itself. I was meant to sacrifice it to him, to return the gift to the giver. But I was foolish. I looked upon its beauty and coveted it for my own herds. I sacrificed a lesser beast, thinking the earth-shaker would not know the difference." Minos laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "The gods always know. Poseidon did not strike me down with a trident. He struck the bull with madness. Now, the creature is a hurricane in flesh, tearing the heart out of my kingdom. It is no longer a beast of the earth. It is the wrath of the sea, walking upon 4 legs." Hercules listened, his expression impassive. He understood the capriciousness of the Olympians better than any mortal. He saw the irony etched into the very walls of the palace. A civilization that worshipped the bull was now being dismantled by one. "Where is the beast now?" Hercules asked, his voice low and steady. "In the western vineyards," Minos replied, clutching the arms of his throne. "It sleeps by day and ravages by night. My hunters are dead or fled. It cannot be killed by spears, for its hide is tough as a gale-force wind. Eurystheus wants it alive. Then you are welcome to it. Take the curse from my island, and you shall have all the wine you can carry." Hercules left the cool sanctity of the palace, stepping out into the blinding afternoon heat. He followed the trail of destruction, a path of broken earth that looked as though a plow the size of a mountain had been dragged through the countryside. The smell of crushed grapes and fermentation grew stronger, a cloying, sweet stench of wasted harvest. He found the creature in a valley that had once been the pride of the Cretan wine trade. The Cretan bull stood amidst the wreckage of a vineyard, white as a breaking wave, its coat gleaming with an unnatural, pearlescent sheen. It was massive, far larger than any natural animal, its muscles rippling like water under the skin. Its horns were long and curved, polished to lethal points, and its breath came in snorts of steam that withered the leaves around it. The beast was not grazing. It was stomping the earth with a rhythmic, hateful intensity, pulverizing the vines not out of hunger, but out of a divine compulsion to destroy. It was the physical manifestation of a god's tantrum. Hercules stepped over a broken stone wall, the sound of his sandal crunching on gravel acting like a thunderclap in the silent valley. The bull froze. Slowly, the massive white head turned, eyes that burned with the blue fire of the deep ocean locked onto the hero. There was no fear in the beast, only a recognition of a challenge equal to its fury. The juxtaposition was stark. The hero, clad in the golden, impenetrable skin of the Nemean lion, representing the raw strength of the earth, standing against the bull of Poseidon, a creature of divine purity and chaotic madness. The civilized world of Gnosis, with its plumbing and its art, felt very far away. Here, in the dust and the heat, the world was reduced to its primal elements. Hercules unclasped his cloak, letting the heavy lion's skin slide from his shoulders to the ground. This was not a fight for armor or weapons. This was a wrestling match, flesh against flesh, will against will. He spread his arms, exposing his chest to the monster. "Come then," Hercules whispered, the challenge carried on the wind. "Let us see whose will is stronger, the Lord of the sea or the Son of the sky." The bull lowered its head, the white horns gleaming like crescent moons, and pawed the earth, tearing a deep gouge in the dry soil. With a bellow that shook the leaves from the olive trees on the distant hills, the beast charged. The ground trembled as the avatar of the ocean surged toward the world walker, bringing with it the crushing weight of the tide. Hercules planted his feet, digging his heels into the bedrock of Crete, and prepared to catch the storm. Chapter 6. The collision between the son of Zeus and the bull of Poseidon was not a meeting of flesh and bone, but a crashing of tectonic plates. The earth of Crete shuddered as Hercules caught the charging beast. His hands, calloused and vast as spades, clamped onto the ivory horns with a grip that could have crushed diamonds. The bull's momentum was terrifying, driving the hero's feet deep into the soil, plowing 2 furrows through the vineyard that stretched for 50 yards. Dust and torn vines exploded around them, obscuring the struggle in a choking cloud of grit and fury. But Hercules did not yield. He did not strike the beast. To strike would be to kill, and his orders were to capture. Instead, he applied the leverage of a mountain. With a roar that rivaled the creature's own bellows, he twisted his torso, torquing the massive white head toward the ground. The muscles of his back coiled like pythons, straining against the divine madness that fueled the animal. Slowly, inexorably, the bull's knees buckled. It fought with the chaotic energy of a storm, thrashing and snorting foam, but it was held fast by a strength that was absolute. When the dust settled, the king of Crete looked down from the safety of the hills to see the impossible. The white monster was pinned, its muzzle pressed into the dirt, its blue eyes wide with the sudden, shocking realization of defeat. Hercules knelt beside it, his chest heaving, his sweat mingling with the beast's foam. He whispered into the animal's ear, a low, rumbling sound that spoke of dominance and calm. The madness of Poseidon did not vanish, but it was cowed by a greater will. Hercules stood, pulling the beast up with him. It did not charge again. It stood trembling, its spirit broken by the realization that it was not the strongest thing on the earth. Now came the true labor. Eurystheus, in his malice, demanded the beast be brought to Mycenae alive. No ship in the harbor of Amnisos could hold such a creature. Its hooves would shatter the hull, and its fury would capsize the vessel in open water. Hercules looked to the north, across the vast, wine-dark expanse of the Aegean Sea. He saw the whitecaps dancing on the waves, and he smiled. "You are of the sea," Hercules said to the bull, vaulting onto its broad, muscular back. "So to the sea we shall return." He drove the bull down the beach and into the surf. The creature hesitated as the cold water lapped at its hooves, but the pressure of the hero's knees against its flanks brooked no argument. Deeper they went, until the ground fell away and they were buoyant. The bull, being a creation of the Earthshaker, swam with a powerful, instinctive grace. Its white head remained above the surface, snorting salt spray, while its legs churned the water like oars. Thus began the long swim. It was a journey that would pass into legend, a feat of endurance that eclipsed the wrestling match in the vineyard. For hours, they were a singular speck of white and gold in a universe of blue. The sun beat down upon them, reflecting off the water in a blinding glare. Hercules sat astride the monster, his hand gripping a single horn for balance, his eyes fixed on the distant, invisible shore of the Peloponnese. He did not sleep. He did not eat. He became the navigator and the captain of this living vessel. When the bull tired and tried to turn back, Hercules urged it forward with a shout that carried over the waves. When the currents of the deep tried to drag them south, he steered the beast with the sheer force of his weight. Night fell, turning the sea into a void of black ink. The stars wheeled overhead, the constellations of the hunter and the bear looking down upon their earthly counterpart. The water grew cold, sapping the warmth from the hero's limbs. Yet Hercules endured. He matched his breathing to the rhythm of the bull's strokes, entering a trance-like state where man and monster became one entity, a hybrid creature of land and sea forging a path through the darkness. At dawn, the gray cliffs of the Argolid rose from the mist. The bull was exhausted, its divine energy spent, its breath coming in ragged gasps. Hercules, too, was weary, his skin pruned and pale from the salt, his eyes rimmed with red. But as the shingle of the beach scraped against the bull's hooves, a surge of triumph revitalized him. They emerged from the surf near the port of Turins, dripping and colossal. The fishermen mending their nets dropped their tools and fled, crying out that a sea monster had come to devour the land. Hercules ignored them. He drove the bull inland, marching up the stone road to the citadel of Mycenae. When he arrived at the Lion Gate, the city fell silent. The people gathered on the walls, staring down in disbelief. They had expected Hercules to return with a hide, or perhaps a story of failure. Instead, they saw him riding the nightmare of Crete as if it were a docile pony. The bull, once a ravager of cities, was now so thoroughly mastered that it barely lifted its head. Eurystheus did not come out to meet him. From the safety of his bronze jar, buried halfway in the earth within the palace courtyard, the herald of the king relayed the message. The labor was complete. The king had seen enough. Hercules slid from the bull's back, his legs heavy as lead. He patted the creature's flank, a gesture of strange camaraderie born of their ordeal in the deep. With a wave of his hand, he released the beast. The Cretan bull, confused and free, wandered away into the hills of Marathon, leaving the hero standing alone in the square. Hercules looked at his hands, still trembling slightly from the strain of the swim, and knew that while the land could be conquered, he had now proven that even the sea could be tamed. Chapter 7. The journey north was a passage into a world stripped of color. Leaving behind the sun-drenched olive groves of the Peloponnese and the azure waters of the Aegean, Hercules marched into the biting winds of Thrace. Here, the sky was a perpetual bruise of gray and violent violet, low-hanging clouds scraping the tops of jagged, pine-covered mountains. This was the domain of Ares, the god of war, a land where the soil was hard, the men were harder, and the laws of civilization frayed into barbarism. The air tasted of iron and impending snow, a sharp contrast to the warm salt breeze of the south. Hercules drew his Nemean lion's skin tighter around his shoulders, the golden pelt the only bright thing in a landscape of shadow and stone. He did not travel entirely alone, for a band of volunteers had been drawn to his legend, young men eager for glory, led by the noble youth Abderus. They marched with the naive enthusiasm of those who had never seen the true face of a monster, their chatter filling the silence of the desolate road. But Hercules remained quiet, his eyes scanning the horizon. He knew that Eurystheus would not send him to the edge of the known world merely to retrieve a herd of horses. There was a darkness here, a rot that festered in the heart of the kingdom of the Bystones. The fortress of King Diomedes rose from the mist like a jagged tooth. It was a structure of black basalt and rough-hewn timber, a palace that looked more like a prison than a seat of royalty. Torches guttered in the wind along the battlements, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach out for the travelers. The gates groaned open not with a welcome, but with a warning shriek of rusted hinges. King Diomedes awaited them in the great hall, a cavernous space that smelled of wood smoke and unwashed bodies. The king was a giant of a man, a true son of Ares, with eyes that burned with a manic, feverish light. He wore armor even in his own home, plates of bronze scarred by countless battles. He greeted Hercules with a smile that did not reach his eyes, a baring of teeth that resembled a snarl more than a grin. "Welcome, son of Zeus," Diomedes boomed, his voice rough as grinding stones. "You come for my mares, do you not? The fame of my herd has reached even the soft lands of the south." Hercules nodded, his stance relaxed but ready. "I have come to take them by the order of Eurystheus." Diomedes laughed, a harsh, barking sound that echoed off the soot-stained rafters. "Take them, then, if you can master them. But first, you must rest. In Thrace, we honor our guests before we test them." The feast was a tense affair. The meat was tough, the wine sour, and the eyes of the Thracian guards never left the visitors. Hercules ate little, his senses attuned to the wrongness that permeated the very stones of the palace. There was a vibration in the floor, a distant, rhythmic thumping that sounded like the heartbeat of the earth itself. And beneath the smell of smoke and sweat, there was another scent, faint, copper-sharp, and terrifyingly familiar. It was the smell of an abattoir. When the moon rose, pale and ghostly behind the clouds, Hercules slipped away from the hall. He followed the sound, that low, thunderous pounding that shook the foundations of the fortress. It led him not to a pasture, but to a heavy stone structure set apart from the main keep. The doors were reinforced with bands of iron, and the windows were barred with thick grates. He pushed the doors open and was immediately assaulted by a wall of heat and stench. This was no stable, it was a dungeon. Inside, the darkness was punctuated by the glow of embers in braziers, illuminating 4 monstrous shapes. They were horses, yes, but they were nightmares given form. Their coats were matted and dark. Their eyes rolled in their sockets with a wild, predatory madness, and their manes were tangled like briar patches. They were immense, their muscles twitching with a surplus of unnatural energy. But what stopped Hercules in his tracks were the restraints. These beasts were not tethered with rope or leather halters. They were bound to the bronze mangers with heavy chains of iron, the links as thick as a man's wrist. The mares, Podargos the swift, Lampon the shining, Xanthos the blonde, and Deinos the terrible, snorted as the hero entered. But the sound was not the whinny of a horse. It was a guttural growl, wet and hungry. They pulled against their chains, the iron shrieking as they snapped their jaws at the empty air. Hercules stepped closer, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He looked into the bronze mangers, expecting to see hay or grain. Instead, he saw the source of the copper smell. The troughs were stained dark with dried fluids, and scattered within them were not oats, but the white, splintered remnants of bone. A human ribcage, picked clean. The shattered dome of a skull. The horror of the realization struck Hercules like a physical blow. These were not merely wild beasts, they were abominations against nature. Diomedes, the king of this accursed land, had twisted these noble creatures into monsters. He had violated the most sacred law of the gods, the law of xenia, of guest friendship. He did not feed his horses grass. He fed them the flesh of the strangers who came to his door seeking shelter. The mares sensed the hero's presence. They turned their heads in unison, their nostrils flaring as they caught his scent. They did not see a master, they saw meat. Foam dripped from their lips, mixed with the red residue of their last meal. Hercules looked into the eyes of Deinos and saw no trace of the animal soul, only a void of hunger and pain. The tyrant of Thrace had created demons in the shape of horses, and in that moment, Hercules knew that simply stealing them would not be enough. The cycle of blood had to be broken, and the architect of this atrocity would have to answer to the son of Zeus. Chapter 8. The heavy wooden doors of the stable slammed shut, sealing Hercules inside the stench-filled gloom with the 4 monstrous mares. But he was not alone for long. The sound of shouting voices and the clatter of armor announced the arrival of King Diomedes and his personal guard. The tyrant of Thrace had not come to offer hospitality, but to witness the spectacle of his favorite pets being fed a demigod. The king stood on the threshold, his silhouette framed by the torchlight of the courtyard, a cruel grin splitting his beard as he anticipated the carnage. "They are hungry, son of Zeus," Diomedes sneered, drawing a jagged xiphos. "Do not keep them waiting." Hercules did not draw a weapon. His rage was a cold, solid thing, a glacier moving through his veins. He looked from the blood-stained mangers to the man who had engineered this abomination. The violation of the natural order was so profound that it required a correction not of steel, but of primal justice. "You have made them monsters," Hercules said, his voice low and vibrating with the power of the earth. "Now you shall see what monsters do." The guards charged, a dozen men hardened by the bitter winds of the north. They were skilled killers, but they were fighting a force of nature. Hercules moved with a terrifying economy of motion. He caught the first spear thrust with a bare hand, snapping the shaft like a dry twig, and used the splintered wood to sweep the legs of the attacker. He fought not with the frenzy of a warrior, but with the grim purpose of an executioner. Bodies were tossed aside like ragdolls, armor crumpling under the impact of his fists. Diomedes, realizing too late that his trap had ensnared a lion rather than a lamb, turned to flee. But Hercules was faster. He lunged across the blood-slicked floor, his hand closing around the king's throat in a grip of iron. He lifted the tyrant into the air, Diomedes' feet kicking helplessly, his eyes bulging with the sudden, crushing realization of his mortality. Hercules carried him to the bronze manger, where the mare known as Danaos the Terrible strained against her chains, her jaws snapping at the scent of fresh fear. "You taught them to hunger for the flesh of men," Hercules intoned, holding the king over the snapping teeth. "It is only right that you provide the final meal." With a heave of his massive shoulders, Hercules cast the king into the trough. The scream that followed was brief, cut short by the sickening crunch of bone and the tearing of flesh. The other mares, maddened by the scent, strained and broke their tethers, converging on their fallen master. The stable fell silent, save for the gruesome sounds of the feast. And then a change occurred. As the last of the tyrant was consumed, the red fire in the eyes of the mares began to dim. The unnatural tension left their muscles. The curse of their diet, sustained only by the cruelty of their master, was broken by his death. They stood in the straw, no longer demons, but simply horses, large, powerful, and calm. The bloodlust had vanished with the blood of the one who instilled it. Hercules stepped back, his chest heaving, the grim labor complete. But as the adrenaline faded, a different kind of silence pressed in on him. He turned to the stable doors, expecting to see his young companion, Abderus, who had been tasked with guarding the entrance. He found the boy lying in the dust of the threshold. In the chaos of the battle, while Hercules had been engaged with the king, the guards had overwhelmed the youth. Abderus lay broken, his lifeblood pooling in the cold earth of Thrace. He had held the line to ensure Hercules could finish the work, paying for the victory with his future. Hercules knelt beside the boy, his large hand gently closing the youth's staring eyes. The victory tasted of ash. He had cleansed the stables of Augeas and tamed the bull of Crete, but here, the cost of the labor was measured in innocence lost. The world walker wept, his tears falling onto the unforgiving soil. He did not leave the body to the scavengers. On that spot, amidst the windswept plains, Hercules dug a tomb with his own hands. But a simple grave was not enough to hold the weight of his grief. He rallied the remaining men, the people of the land who had lived in fear of Diomedes, and commanded them to build. Around the tomb of Abderus, a city began to rise. It would be called Abdera, a sanctuary founded on memory and sorrow, a testament to the price of heroism. When the work was done, Hercules gathered the 4 mares, now tame as lambs. He led them down the winding road toward the sea, leaving the dark fortress of Diomedes empty and silent behind him. The impossible labors of the mainland were finished, but the road stretched on. Hercules looked to the south, where the world was wide and the sea was waiting. He was a hero of the solitary path no longer. The ghosts of the fallen now walked with him, and the whispers of a great gathering, a voyage of the greatest heroes of the age, began to drift on the wind. The Argo was calling. Chapter 9. The wind that swept down from the jagged peaks of Mount Pelion carried more than the scent of pine and snow. It carried a rumor that set the blood of every ambitious man in Greece on fire. Word had spread from the bustling port of Iolcos, whispering of a ship unlike any the world had ever seen. A vessel with a soul carved from the sacred oaks of Dodona, and a destiny that pointed toward the sunrise. Jason, the dispossessed prince with the single sandal and the golden tongue, was calling for the greatest heroes of the age. He sought to cross the inhospitable sea, to thread the crushing rocks of the Symplegades, and to steal the golden fleece from the dragon-guarded groves of Colchis. Hercules heard the call while the dust of Thrace still clung to his sandals. He was weary, not of body, for his stamina was inexhaustible, but of the solitude of his penance. The labors commanded by Eurystheus had been a lonely road, a sequence of grim struggles against beasts and filth, where his only companions were his own dark thoughts and the echoing silence of the gods. The prospect of an expedition, a brotherhood of warriors bound for the edge of the map, offered a reprieve from the suffocating weight of his personal atonement. With his young squire Hylas at his side, Hercules turned his back on the northern mists and marched south toward the Pagasetic Gulf. When they crested the final ridge overlooking the harbor of Pagasae, the sight that greeted them was enough to stir the heart of even a jaded demigod. The Argo sat in the dry dock, her hull gleaming with fresh pitch, her lines sleek and predatory. She was a masterpiece of naval architecture, built under the guidance of Athena herself. Around her, the beach was a kaleidoscope of heraldry and armor. The gathering was a roll call of legends in the making. There was Orpheus, tuning a lyre that could charm stones to weep. The Boreads, Zetes, and Calais, stretching wings that shimmered with the iridescent hues of the north wind. Peleus and Telamon, brothers in arms and fathers of future wars, and Castor and Polydeuces, the Gemini twins, moving with a synchronized grace that defied explanation. It was a gathering of kings, princes, and sons of gods, each a hero in his own right, each accustomed to being the strongest man in the room. They laughed and boasted, testing their spears and wrestling in the sand, a vibrant display of youthful arrogance and unspent power. Then Hercules stepped onto the beach. The chatter died instantly. The wrestling matches ceased, the combatants breaking apart to stare. The silence that swept over the assembly was not one of respect, but of sudden, crushing intimidation. Hercules did not walk like a prince. He walked like a landslide. He was a head taller than the tallest man there, his shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. The skin of the Nemean lion was draped over his back, the golden jaws acting as a cowl that framed a face etched with the trauma of the impossible labors. He carried a club of olive wood that was as thick as a mainmast, and his bow, slung casually across his chest, was of a draw weight no other man present could hope to budge. The dynamic of the expedition shifted in a single heartbeat. Before his arrival, this had been a high-stakes adventure for glory-seeking aristocrats. Now, with the World Walker in their midst, it had become a crusade of titans. The other heroes looked at their own weapons and found them wanting. They looked at their own deeds and found them small. Jason, hiding his anxiety behind a practiced smile, stepped forward to greet the newcomer. The leader of the Argonauts was a man of charisma and vision, but standing before Hercules, he looked fragile. He knew, as they all did, that the hierarchy of power had just been violently rearranged. "Son of Zeus," Jason said, extending a hand that trembled ever so slightly. "We did not dare hope you would come. The Argo is honored. Nay, the Argo is yours to command. Surely, the greatest among us should lead this voyage." A murmur of agreement ran through the crew. It was the logical choice. Who else but the man who strangled the lion and cleaned the stables of Elys could lead them against the terrors of the East? Hercules looked down at Jason, then at the eager, terrified faces of the crew. He saw the burden in Jason's eyes, the desperate need to reclaim his birthright. Hercules had no need for thrones or titles. His burden was of a different sort. He rested the head of his great club in the sand, the impact vibrating through the beach. "I did not come to steer," Hercules rumbled, his voice deep and resonant as the surf. "I came to row. "You are the captain, Jason. It is your quest and your fleece to win. I am but a shield for the ship." He placed a massive hand on Jason's shoulder, a gesture that was both a blessing and a warning. "But know this, where we go, death will follow. I will keep it at bay as long as I can, but the edge of the world is no place for boys." With that, Hercules strode toward the ship, Hylas trotting faithfully in his wake. He threw his gear onto the designated bench, the stroke seat, the position of hardest labor, and sat down, filling the space of 2 men. The crew watched him, awestruck. The tension broke, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. They had their captain, but more importantly, they had their monster slayer. The Argo was no longer just a ship, it was a weapon, and its edge was the son of Zeus. Chapter 10. The shipwright Argus was a man of geometry and dreams, a visionary who saw in the rough timber of Mount Pelion the curvature of a vessel that could defy the gods of the deep. But visions have a weight that reality often refuses to bear. On the white sands of Pagasae, the skeleton of the Argo rose like the ribcage of a primeval leviathan, a lattice of pale wood destined to conquer the wine-dark seas. Yet, before the hull could be planked, the spine of the ship, the great keel beam hewn from the sacred oaks of the high slopes, lay immovable in the sand. It was a log of such density and girth that it seemed to possess its own gravitational pull, a piece of the mountain that refused to become part of the ocean. The assembled heroes, the flower of Greek nobility, threw themselves at the timber. Peleus and Telamon, men whose strength would one day birth the conquerors of Troy, strained against the rough bark until the veins stood out on their necks like cords of rope. The Boreads, sons of the north wind, fluttered their wings in a desperate attempt to generate lift. But the oak remained stubborn, rooted to the earth by its own immense mass. It was a moment of humbling silence. The greatest warriors of the age were defeated not by a monster, but by gravity. Then the earth shook. A rhythmic thudding announced the approach of Hercules. He had been up on the mountain, felling trees where the slopes were too steep for the oxen. He emerged from the tree line, a titan against the green backdrop, carrying a trunk of pine across each shoulder as casually as a shepherd carries a lamb. He dropped the logs near the fire pits, the impact sending a cloud of dust over the sweating nobles. Seeing the stalled construction, Hercules wiped the resin from his hands and approached the keel beam. He did not ask for leverage. He did not call for ropes or pulleys. He simply bent his knees, wedged his shoulder, clad in the impenetrable skin of the Nemean lion, under the center of the massive oak, and straightened his legs. There was a groan, not from the man, but from the wood, as the timber was hoisted into the air. The heroes stepped back, mouths agape, as Hercules walked the length of the shipyard, the foundational bone of the Argo balanced perfectly upon his frame. He was a walking oak himself, a force of nature transplanting the forest to the shore. With a grunt that sounded like a shifting tectonic plate, he lowered the beam into the cradle Argus had prepared, aligning it with a precision that belied his raw power. For weeks, this became the rhythm of the work. When a hammer was too light to drive a bronze spike through the heartwood, Hercules used his fist. When the planks needed to be bent to the curve of the prow, Hercules held them in place while the steam did its work, his skin impervious to the scalding heat. He spoke little, his focus absolute, his presence transforming the chaotic shipyard into a place of awe. He was the engine of the expedition, the silent current that drove the project forward when human strength failed. Finally, the Argo stood complete. She was a thing of beauty, painted in vermilion and blue, her prow staring boldly at the horizon. Athena herself had come in the night to fit the speaking timber of Dodona into the bow, giving the ship a voice and a soul. But she sat high on the dry sand, heavy with pitch, bronze, and the supplies for 50 men. The path to the water was lined with greased rollers, yet the ship was a fortress of wood, unwilling to leave the safety of the land. "Push," Jason cried, his voice cracking with desperation. "Together, brothers, for the glory of the fleece." The 50 Argonauts lined the hull, their shoulders pressed against the wood. They pushed with a unity of purpose, their boots digging trenches in the sand. They shouted, they heaved, they prayed to Poseidon, but the Argo did not budge. The friction of the dry dock held her fast. The sun beat down, mocking their ambition. It seemed the quest would end before it had even begun, a ship of legends stranded 10 yards from the tide. Hercules, who had been loading the final amphory of wine, stepped down from the deck. He walked to the stern of the ship, where the curve of the hull rose steeply above his head. He placed his back against the wood, his feet planted wide in the shifting sand. He closed his eyes, centering his breathing, drawing upon the deep, inexhaustible well of vitality that flowed from his divine blood. He did not shove. He expanded. He drove his legs into the earth until he found the bedrock beneath the beach. The muscles of his back coiled and snapped tight. A low rumble started in his chest, growing in volume until it matched the roar of the surf. "Geo," he bellowed, the sound echoing off the cliffs of Pelion. With a single, explosive release of kinetic energy, Hercules drove backward. The sand around his feet liquefied under the pressure. The Argo groaned, a high-pitched shriek of timber overcoming inertia. And then she moved. Slowly at first, then gaining speed as the rollers caught the momentum. The heroes at the sides scrambled to keep up, cheering wildly as the great ship slid down the beach. She hit the water with a tremendous splash, the sea accepting her weight with a plume of white spray. The Argo bobbed on the swell, alive and eager, born from the sweat of kings, and the might of one god-born man. Hercules stood alone on the shore, brushing the sand from his lion's skin, watching the ship turn into the wind, ready to carry the world on his shoulders once more. Chapter 11. The wind had died 3 days prior, leaving the Argo adrift on a mirror of polished glass. The great ship, for all its divine pedigree, was heavy, and the burden of movement fell to the muscles of the 50 heroes. They rowed in a rhythm that had become their heartbeat, the splash of the oars, and the creak of the leather straps the only sounds in a silent world. Sweat slicked their backs, and the salt spray had crusted in their beards, turning the golden youth of Greece into haggard, sun-bleached wanderers. They craved land, not for glory, but for the simple, forgotten mercy of a night without motion. When the volcanic peaks of Lemnos rose from the haze, a cheer went up that was raw and ragged. This was the island of Hephaestus, the forge god, a place known for its fires and its industry. But as the Argo drew closer, threading the needle between the jagged cliffs that guarded the harbor of Myrina, the heroes were met with a sensation that was deeply, unsettlingly wrong. The harbor was a masterpiece of stone, built to shelter a fleet of trading vessels, yet the water was empty. There were no fishing boats bobbing on the tide, no merchant galleys being loaded with amphorae of wine or ingots of iron. The docks were silent. The great cranes stood still against the sky like the skeletons of prehistoric birds. And on the sea walls, watching the approach of the strange Greek ship, stood a legion of figures. They wore armor, bronze breastplates that glinted in the sun, and helmets crested with horsehair. But they did not stand like men. Their silhouettes were curvaceous, their stances fluid. It was an army of women. Jason, standing at the prow in his purple cloak, signaled for peace, holding his hands open to show he bore no weapon. The Argo glided to the pier, and the gangplank was lowered with a heavy thud. The heroes disembarked, their hands hovering near their sword hilts, confused by the eerie quiet. There were no children playing in the streets, no old men sitting in the shade of the olive trees. There was only the female gaze, multiplied by the 1,000, intense and evaluating. From the ranks of the warriors emerged a woman of striking beauty, wearing the royal diadem. This was Queen Hippolyta, young and regal, yet possessing eyes that held the shadow of a terrible secret. She looked over the Argonauts, seeing the grime of the sea and the strength of their limbs. A tension seemed to break in the air, replaced by a collective exhale from the watching women. They did not see invaders, they saw salvation. "Welcome to Lemnos," Hippolyta said, her voice smooth as dark honey. "You are far from home, strangers. Our city is quiet. The men of Lemnos are gone, exiled for their treachery and neglect. We are a city of widows and daughters, left to fend for ourselves against the cruelty of the world." It was a lie, smooth and practiced. The truth was buried in the shallow graves of the island and stained into the floorboards of every home. A night of madness where the women, scorned by husbands who had taken Thracian captives as concubines, had risen up and slaughtered every male on the island. Fathers, husbands, sons, all gone in a single night of blood. But the Argonauts, blinded by the beauty of the queen and the weariness in their bones, did not see the ghosts that haunted the streets of Myrina. They saw only smiling faces, open doors, and the promise of soft beds. The seduction was immediate and overwhelming. The women of Lemnos, starving for companionship and fearing the eventual attack of the Thracians, threw open their city. The smell of roasting lamb and spiced wine replaced the stench of brine. The heroes were ushered into the great halls, where baths were drawn and oil was poured. The rough discipline of the ship evaporated in the heat of the hearth. Jason, the leader who was meant to be the sharpest spear of the expedition, was the first to dull his edge. He was led away by Hippolyta to the royal palace, captivated by her tragic tale and her warm embrace. The crew followed suit, scattering into the city, each hero finding a home, a meal, and a lover. The Argo was left bobbing alone at the dock, a forgotten wooden shell. Only Hercules remained immune to the siren's song of comfort. He stood on the quay, his massive arms crossed over his chest, watching his comrades dissolve into the domestic bliss of the cursed island. He saw what they missed: the rust gathering on the plows in the fields, the cold forges where the fires of industry had long gone out, and the frantic, desperate edge to the women's laughter. He smelled the stagnation in the air. This was not a haven, it was a spider's web, woven from silk and desire. He did not go into the city. He sat on the rowing bench of the Argo, the wood hard and unforgiving beneath him, and sharpened his arrows. Hylas, his squire, stayed by his side, looking longingly at the lights of the town, but fearing the disapproval of his master more than he desired the comforts of the island. Hercules waited, listening to the sounds of revelry drift down from the Acropolis, knowing that the greatest threat to their quest was not a dragon or a storm, but the slow, sweet rot of complacency. The fleece was forgotten, replaced by the warmth of the hearth, and the heroes of Greece were in danger of becoming nothing more than husbandmen on an island of murderers. Chapter 12. The sun rose over the harbor of Myrina, not as a herald of action, but as a lazy spectator to the slow decay of ambition. One day had bled seamlessly into the next, forming a sluggish river of weeks that threatened to drown the legend of the Argonauts before it had truly begun. The Argo, the vessel carved from the sacred oaks of Dodona and destined to brave the crushing rocks of the Symplegades, sat neglected at the quay. Her hull, once sleek with fresh pitch, was now bearded with long strands of green algae that waved in the current like the hair of drowned men. The rigging, which should have been singing in the wind, hung slack and lifeless, swaying in the gentle, mocking breeze that carried the scent of jasmine and stagnation. Where were the sons of the north wind? Where were the Gemini twins, Castor and Polydeuces? Where was Telamon, the wall of the Achaeans? They were not on the deck sharpening their spears, nor were they studying the stars to chart a course for the dangerous waters of the Black Sea. They were in the city, draped in linens that smelled of lavender rather than the honest musk of effort and salt. They had traded their shields for heavy goblets of sweet wine and their swords for the soft, enclosing embrace of the Lemnian women. The trap had not been sprung with steel or magic, but with a terrifying domesticity. The widows of Lemnos, desperate to fill the silence of their homes and hide the ghosts of their murdered husbands, had woven a net not of iron, but of comfort. They offered the weary sailors a life without the threat of death, a kingdom without a king, and a bed without a cold dawn. The heroes of Greece, men who sought immortality through deeds, had been seduced by the mortality of ease. Even Jason, the man chosen by Hera to lead the quest, had forgotten the dragon of Colchis. He sat on the throne beside Queen Hypsipyle, his head crowned with wilting flowers, listening to the sweet lies of a peace that was built upon a foundation of treachery. But on the rotting deck of the Argo, one man remained. Hercules paced the length of the ship, his heavy sandals thudding against the wood like the tolling of a funeral bell. He was a caged lion, a force of kinetic energy trapped in a static world. To him, the laughter drifting down from the Acropolis was not a sound of joy, but a screeching insult to their purpose. He refused to leave the ship. He refused the trays of roast meat and the amphorae of wine sent down by the queen's servants, smashing the vessels on the stones of the pier, and sending the servants fleeing back to the city. He felt the stagnation physically, like a layer of grime on his skin that no water could wash away. He looked at Hylas, his young squire, who sat near the stern polishing a shield that had not seen battle in weeks. The boy's eyes kept darting toward the glowing lights of the town, filled with a youthful longing for the warmth of the hearth and the company of the smiling women. Hercules placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his grip heavy enough to bruise. "Do not look at the fire, boy," Hercules rumbled, his voice a low growl that vibrated through the ship's timbers. "That fire burns the will to ash. A hero who sleeps in silk wakes up a servant." Hercules walked to the prow and looked out at the open sea. The horizon was clean and sharp, a line of blue that promised danger and glory. He turned back to the city, his lip curling in disgust. He saw a figure stumbling down the cobblestones. It was one of the crew, his armor unbuckled, laughing at a joke only he could hear, his arm around a woman who looked at him with a possessive hunger. The disgust rose in the hero's throat, bitter as bile. He remembered the impossible labors, the crushing weight of the sky, the suffocating stench of the stables, the raw, muscle-tearing struggle with the bull. Those were honest pains. This was a slow, suffocating death of the soul. The soft trap had clamped its jaws tight around the expedition, paralyzing the greatest assembly of warriors the world had ever known. Hercules gripped the rail of the ship, the wood groaning and splintering under his fingers. He realized then that words would not be enough. If the Argo was to sail, he would have to become the storm that woke them from their slumber. The time for patience had passed. The time for the club had returned. Chapter 13. The silence of the Argo was finally broken not by the wind, but by the furious tread of the son of Zeus. Hercules descended the gangplank, his heavy club resting on his shoulder like a judgment waiting to fall. He marched through the empty streets of Myrina, his shadow stretching long and terrifying against the sun-bleached walls. The city was drunk on peace, lulled into a stupor by the sweet wine and the soft embrace of its widows. But the world walker brought with him the cold, hard reality of the open sea. He did not knock at the doors of the royal palace. He simply pushed them open, the heavy timber groaning in protest as the bronze hinges buckled under his casual strength. Inside the great hall, the air was thick with the scent of jasmine, roasting meats, and unwashed bodies. The heroes of the expedition, the kings and princes of Greece, lay scattered on cushions of silk, their armor discarded in corners like toys of a forgotten childhood. Jason, the chosen of Hera, sat at the feet of Queen Hypsipyle, a goblet of wine in his hand, and a wreath of wilting laurels askew on his head. He looked up as the massive silhouette of Hercules blocked the light from the entrance, blinking through a haze of intoxication. The music died. The laughter caught in the throats of the revelers. Hercules stood in the center of the room, a monolith of scarred muscle and lion fur amidst the sea of linen and indulgence. He looked at his comrades, not with anger, but with a disappointment so profound it burned hotter than rage. So Hercules rumbled, his voice echoing off the stone walls like distant thunder. "Is this the golden fleece? Have we sailed to the ends of the earth to become farmers and consorts?" He stepped closer to Jason, kicking a discarded shield across the floor. It spun with a metallic clang that rang out like an alarm bell in the silent hall. "Look at you," Hercules spat, his gaze sweeping over the assembled legends. The flower of Greece, the sons of gods, withered by a warm bed and a full belly. While you rot here, the dragon of Colchis sleeps on its hoard, mocking your names. While you play at being husbands, the world forgets you. Jason attempted to stand, his face flushing with a mixture of wine and sudden, piercing shame. "Hercules," he stammered, the winds were against us. We merely waited for the season to turn. The winds wait for no man, and neither does glory." Hercules roared, striking the floor with the butt of his club. The impact shook the dust from the rafters. "You are not waiting for the wind. You are hiding from the storm. You have traded your destiny for a soft life. If this is the limit of your ambition, then stay. Stay and rot. I will take the Argo myself. I will row it with my own hands if I must. And I will tell the world that Jason and his Argonauts died not in battle, but in a bed of flowers." The words struck with the force of physical blows. The spell of Lemnos, woven not of magic, but of comfort, shattered under the weight of the hero's scorn. Telamon looked at his hands, calloused from the oar, but now softened by idleness. The Boreads shifted their wings, suddenly feeling the itch of the sky. The shame was absolute, a cold bucket of water that washed away the lethargy of the past weeks. Slowly, painfully, the heroes began to rise. The women of Lemnos, sensing the shift, clung to them, their eyes filled with tears and desperation. They whispered promises of love, of children, of a life without war. Hypsipyle placed a hand on Jason's arm, a silent plea to remain, to be the king she needed. But Jason looked at Hercules, standing immovable as a mountain, and saw the reflection of the man he was supposed to be. "Forgive us, Hypsipyle," Jason whispered, gently removing her hand. "We are not men of peace. We are the Argonauts." The retreat from the city was a somber procession. There were no cheers, only the sound of weeping from the city walls and the clatter of armor being strapped back onto bodies that had grown sluggish. They marched back to the harbor, heads bowed, under the watchful, unforgiving eye of Hercules. He walked at the rear, the shepherd herding the stray sheep back to the fold. When they reached the Argo, the ship seemed to shudder with relief as the crew stepped back onto the deck. They took their places at the benches, the familiar wood hard against their skin. Hercules took his seat at the stroke bench, his face grim. "Row," he commanded, a single word that carried the weight of their salvation. The oars dipped into the water, cutting through the stagnation of the harbor. As the ship pulled away, the heroes did not look back at the weeping queen or the soft beds they had left behind. They looked forward to the north and the east, where the sea was dark and the monsters were real. They had been saved from oblivion by the harsh discipline of the World Walker. And as the wind finally caught the sail, they knew that the hardest labor was not fighting giants, but remembering who they were. Chapter 14. The Propontis Sea was a deceptive calm before the coming storm. The waters here were cold, fed by the great rivers of the north and the treacherous currents that flowed from the Euxine Sea beyond the straits. The Argo cut through the gray waves, her crew silent and focused, the shame of Lemnos still a fresh scar on their pride. They rowed with a renewed discipline, the rhythm set by the relentless stroke of Hercules, whose back was a wall of muscle that never seemed to tire. Ahead, the coastline rose abruptly from the sea, dominated by a massive, brooding promontory known to sailors as Bear Mountain. It was a wild, untamed place, its slopes choked with dense forests of pine and fir, its peaks shrouded in a perpetual mist that clung to the rock like tattered wool. The mountain did not look welcoming. It looked like a fortress built by the earth itself, guarding secrets that were not meant for mortal eyes. Jason, eager to prove his leadership and refill the ship's dwindling stores of fresh water and meat, ordered the Argo to make landfall in a secluded cove at the mountain's base. The anchor splashed into the dark water, and the ship swung around to face the wind. "We need supplies," Jason announced, his voice carrying over the deck. "Half the crew will go inland to hunt and fill the casks. The rest will stay to guard the ship." It was a sensible command, the logic of a captain. But logic has little sway in the lands of monsters. The crew split, the hunting party disappearing into the thick undergrowth, their laughter and chatter fading quickly as the forest swallowed them. Hercules remained on the beach, ostensibly to guard the ship. But in truth, he felt a vibration in the earth that unsettled him. He sat on a large drift log, whittling a new shaft for an arrow, his eyes scanning the high ridges above. Up there in the jagged rocks where the mist swirled thickest, they were being watched. The Gegenees were not men, though they walked on two legs. They were the earthborn, sons of Gaia, creatures of primal clay and stone who had been old when the gods were young. They were giants, towering over the tallest human, with skin the color of wet mud and faces that were brutal slabs of cartilage and bone. But it was their arms that marked them as abominations. From their massive shoulders sprouted not two, but 6 limbs, 2 to grapple, 2 to crush, and 2 to hurl the boulders that were their preferred weapons. They crouched on the precipice, blending perfectly with the stone, their breathing slow and deep like the wind in a cavern. They watched the hunting party move away from the ship, their eyes narrowing with malicious intent. They were not mindless beasts. They were hunters of a different sort, patient and cruel. They knew that a ship divided was a ship vulnerable. They waited until the sounds of the Argonauts had drifted far into the interior, until the beach was quiet save for the lapping of the waves and the rhythmic scraping of Hercules's knife against wood. The leader of the giants, a behemoth with a scar running through one milky eye, signaled silently to his kin. They began to descend, moving down the sheer cliffs with a terrifying, scuttling grace. They did not shout or roar. They flowed down the mountain like a landslide in slow motion, bringing with them an arsenal of rocks and uprooted trees. Their target was not the men in the forest, but the ship itself. If they could crush the Argo, the heroes would be trapped, food for the winter. Hercules paused in his work. The birds in the forest had gone silent. The wind had shifted, carrying with it a scent that was ancient and heavy, the smell of wet earth and raw ozone. He stood up, dropping the arrow shaft, and reached for his club. He looked up toward the ridge line, his eyes piercing the mist, and saw the first boulder detach itself from the cliff face. It fell silently at first, then with a growing whistle, slamming into the sand just yards from the Argo's stern. The trap was sprung. The Earthborn were coming, and the World Walker stood alone between the monsters and the only hope of returning home. Chapter 15. The first boulder struck the water with the force of a falling star, sending a plume of spray high enough to drench the deck of the Argo. The ship rocked violently, her timbers groaning in protest, as the peaceful cove transformed into a killing zone. From the mist-shrouded ridges of Bear Mountain, the Gegenees descended like a landslide of flesh and hate. They did not shout war cries. Their attack was a silent, terrifying deluge of stone and fury. They were the earthborn, six-armed monstrosities that scrambled over the jagged rocks with the agility of spiders. Their multiple limbs clutching boulders the size of wine casks. Hercules stood alone on the narrow strip of beach, a solitary golden figure against the gray wall of the mountain. The rest of the crew, including Jason and the mighty Telamon, were deep in the forest, their shouts of alarm distant and muffled by the dense pine canopy. The defense of the Argo, the only lifeline back to the world of men, fell entirely to the son of Zeus. He did not wait for the enemy to reach the sand. Hercules unslung his great bow, the weapon of yew wood that no other mortal could bend. He planted his feet wide, digging his sandals into the wet gravel, and drew the string back to his ear. The air hummed with tension. Thrum. The first arrow flew, a blur of motion that defied the eye. It struck the lead giant in the throat, piercing the thick, muddy hide and dropping the beast mid-stride. The giant tumbled down the scree, taking a cascade of loose rock with it, but the horde behind him did not slow. They were relentless, the air filled with flying stones as the giants hurled their ammunition from the heights. Hercules moved with a fluidity that belied his size, dancing between the impacts. A boulder smashed into the spot where he had stood a heartbeat before, shattering into fragments. Another glanced off the hull of the ship, splintering the railing. Hercules returned fire, his movements a blur of rhythmic destruction. Knock, draw, loose, every arrow found a mark, an eye, a knee, a chest. But for every giant that fell, two more seemed to crawl from the crevices of the earth. Come down and face me. Hercules roared, his voice cutting through the crash of stone. Or are you only brave when throwing rocks from the sky? As if in answer, a group of 5 giants reached the beach, their 6 arms flailing, brandishing clubs made from uprooted trees. They charged the hero, a wall of muscle and violence. Hercules dropped his bow and drew his own club, the olive wood bludgeon that had cracked the skulls of lions and kings. He met the charge head-on. The collision was seismic. He ducked under a swinging tree trunk, driving his shoulder into the midriff of the first attacker, lifting the creature off its feet and hurling it into the surf. He spun, his club connecting with the jaw of the second, a blow that sounded like a thunderclap, but the sheer weight of numbers was against him. A stone struck his shoulder, bruising even his divine flesh. Another grazed his temple, blood trickling down into his eyes. He was encircled, fighting a whirlwind of limbs and wood. He roared again, a sound of pure, primal defiance, summoning the last reserves of his strength to hold the line. He could not fall. If he fell, the ship would be crushed, and the quest would end in ruin on this forgotten shore. Just as the giants began to press in, sensing the hero's fatigue, a horn blast echoed from the tree line. The hunting party had returned. Jason, sword drawn, burst from the undergrowth, followed by the Boreads, who took to the sky with swords flashing. Telamon and Peleus charged with spears lowered, a phalanx of 2 against the flank of the horde. To the ship, protect the ship. Jason screamed, rallying his men. The tide of battle turned. The Argonauts, shamed by their earlier complacency on Lemnos, fought with a desperate ferocity. Arrows from the archers in the trees rained down on the giants still on the cliffs. The Boreads dive-bombed the creatures, striking from above. Hercules, revitalized by the arrival of his brothers in arms, went on the offensive. He shattered the line of the Earthborn, driving them back toward the rocks. The giants, realizing their prey was not helpless, broke and fled. They scrambled back up the mountain, leaving their dead strewn across the beach like broken statues. The retreat was chaotic, a scramble for the safety of the mist. Silence returned to the cove, heavy and ragged. The Argonauts stood amidst the carnage, chests heaving, weapons dripping with dark, earthy blood. Hercules leaned on his club, wiping the sweat and gore from his brow. He looked at the Argo, battered but whole, floating quietly in the bay. He nodded once to Jason, a silent acknowledgement of the crew's valor. They had survived the ambush, but the mountains still loomed above them, a reminder that in the wild places of the world, peace was only ever a pause between battles. Chapter 16. The dust of battle settled slowly over the cove of Bear Mountain, coating the dead in a shroud of gray grit. The silence that followed the retreat of the Earthborn was not the peace of a meadow, but the heavy, ringing stillness of a crypt. The beach, once a pristine stretch of white sand, was now a charnel house of broken stone and twisted anatomy. The bodies of the Gegenees lay like fallen monuments to a chaotic age, their 6 arms tangled in death, their massive, clay-like limbs obscuring the shoreline. They did not bleed like men. A thick, black ichor pooled around them, smelling of wet slate and deep, subterranean rot. The Argonauts moved through the carnage with the hesitant steps of men who have peered over the edge of a cliff and seen the abyss looking back. There were no cheers of victory, no raising of spears in triumph. The reality of the ambush sat like a stone in their stomachs. They looked at the dents in the Argo's hull, where boulders the size of chariots had glanced off the sacred oak. They looked at the splintered trees that had been wielded as clubs. And then, inevitably, they looked at Hercules. The son of Zeus sat on a drift log near the water's edge, methodically cleaning his olive wood club with a handful of sea moss. He was covered in the dust of the mountain and the blood of the giants, a golden statue marred by the filth of war. He did not look up as Jason approached, his breath still catching in his chest. We would have been lost," Jason said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual princely cadence. He looked at the carnage, then back to the hero. "If you had not held the beach, the ship would be kindling, and we would be trapped in this cursed land." Hercules stopped his scrubbing. He looked out at the dark waters of the Propontis, his eyes reflecting the deep, melancholic wisdom of a man who knows that survival is often just a matter of standing ground when others run. The earth has many children, Jason, Hercules rumbled, his voice low. And not all of them love the children of men. You seek the golden fleece, a thing of light. But the path to the light must always pass through the shadow. He stood, and the movement was enough to make the nearby crewmen flinch. The battle had changed the way they saw him. On the beach at Pagasae, he had been a legend, a celebrity to be admired. Now he was a force of nature, a terrifying necessity. They realized that without him, their grand expedition was nothing more than a fragile boat of boys sailing into the jaws of monsters. "Check the hull," Hercules commanded, shifting seamlessly from warrior to sailor. The giants threw heavy stones. If the ribs are cracked, the sea will finish what the earthborn started. The crew sprang into action, grateful for a task to occupy their trembling hands. Argus, the shipwright, inspected the damage with a critical eye, muttering prayers to Athena as he caulked the seams where the impact of the boulders had loosened the pitch. The repair work was done in haste, for the sun was dipping low over the western ridges, and the shadows of Bear Mountain were lengthening, reaching out like the grasping fingers of the giants they had just slain. No one wanted to be on this shore when darkness fell. When the order to board was finally given, the Argonauts practically scrambled up the gangplank. They pushed off from the bloody sand with a desperation that spoke of fear. The oars bit into the water, churning the dark surf, and the Argo swung her prow toward the open sea, putting distance between herself and the fortress of the Earthborn. As they rode into the twilight, a somber mood settled over the ship. The wine skins remained corked. The lyre of Orpheus remained silent in its case. The men rode with their heads down, lost in their own thoughts. They were beginning to understand the true cost of the glory they sought. This was not a song to be sung in a warm hall. It was a gauntlet of terror. Hercules sat at the stroke bench, setting the rhythm. He did not look back at the mountain. He knew that the monsters were never truly gone. They were simply behind them, while others waited ahead. He looked at Hylas, who sat near his feet, polishing the hero's shield. The boy looked pale, his eyes wide as he stared at the receding coastline. Hercules felt a pang of protectiveness, a heaviness in his heart that had nothing to do with the physical labor. He was the wall between these men and the dark, but even a wall can erode. The Argo sailed on, a tiny speck of defiance on a vast and indifferent ocean. The stars began to emerge, cold and distant, guiding them further east, further from home, and deeper into the unknown. The victory belonged to them, but the sorrow of the world walked with them, a silent passenger on the deck of the speaking ship. Chapter 17. The sea was a flat expanse of indigo, stretching endlessly toward the horizon where the sky met the water in a haze of heat. The Argo moved across this stillness, not by the grace of the wind, for the air hung heavy and dead, but by the sweat of kings. To pass the time and to shake off the lingering dread of the earthborn ambush, the heroes had turned their labor into a contest. It was a game of endurance, a test to see whose spirit would break first under the relentless rhythm of the stroke. One by one, the great champions of Greece faltered. The sun beat down upon their backs, turning the rowing benches into instruments of torture. Castor and Polydeuces, the Gemini twins, finally rested their oars, their chests heaving, acknowledging defeat with weary smiles. Telamon and Peleus, rivals in all things, bowed their heads over their knees, their strength spent. Soon, only one oar continued to dip and rise, driving the ship forward with the steady, thundering cadence of a heartbeat. Hercules sat alone at the stroke bench. He was in a trance of exertion, his eyes fixed on the receding wake. He did not row for glory, He rode because motion was the only thing that quieted the noise in his mind. He pulled with the force of a tectonic plate shifting, dragging the 50-oared galley through the water as if it were a toy. But the wood of the world is not made to withstand the strength of the gods. As Hercules surged forward for another stroke, applying the full torque of his massive shoulders, a sharp crack rang out like a gunshot across the silent water. The hero fell backward, the handle of the oar still gripped in his fist. The blade, snapped clean at the fulcrum, drifted away in the current. Hercules stared at the broken wood, a look of mild annoyance crossing his face. His own strength had once again betrayed him, turning a tool into kindling. With the engine of their progress silenced, the Argo drifted toward the coast of Mysia. It was a tranquil land, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon. The shore was lined with white pebbles, and beyond the beach lay a dense, verdant forest that promised shade and fresh water. Jason, grateful for the excuse to stop, ordered the ship to make landfall. They would camp for the night, eat fresh meat, and cut a new oar for their champion. The keel grated against the stones, and the crew disembarked, their voices hushed by the serene beauty of the place. It was a stark contrast to the jagged, mist-shrouded peaks of Bear Mountain. Here, the air smelled of pine resin and wildflowers, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of the waves. Hercules did not rest. He tossed the splintered remains of his oar onto the sand and turned toward the tree line. "I need wood," he rumbled, his voice low. "Strong wood, pine or ash. And I shall bring water for the meal," a bright voice chirped from behind him. Hercules turned to see Hylas, his squire and companion. The youth stood holding a bronze pitcher, the metal gleaming in the twilight. Hylas was everything Hercules was not: graceful, fair of face, and full of an unburdened joy that the older hero found both baffling and necessary. Hylas was the anchor that kept the world walker's humanity from drifting away entirely. He was the reminder that there was softness in the world worth protecting. "Be wary, Hylas," Hercules said, his brow furrowing slightly. "The woods are deep, and the twilight plays tricks on the eyes. Do not stray far from the path. I will be back before you have found your tree," Hylas promised with a grin, adjusting his tunic. "The spring is just beyond that ridge. I can hear it singing." Hercules watched the boy walk away, the bronze pitcher swinging by his side, until he disappeared into the green shadows of the forest. A strange unease prickled at the back of the hero's neck, a premonition he could not name, but he shook it off. He had a task to perform. Hercules plunged into the woods, moving through the undergrowth like a tank. He ignored the smaller trees, seeking a giant worthy of the Argo. Deeper and deeper he went, until he found it, a towering pine, straight as a spear and thick as a column. It was a king of the forest, its branches brushing the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. He did not use an axe. He laid his bow and quiver on the mossy ground and wrapped his arms around the trunk. He dug his feet into the loam, feeling the roots of the tree trembling deep within the earth. With a roar that startled the roosting birds, Hercules heaved. The ground groaned and tore open. Roots snapped with the sound of breaking bones. Slowly, inexorably, the great pine began to tilt. With one final, earth-shaking effort, Hercules uprooted the tree entirely, lifting the massive log onto his shoulder. He stood there for a moment, a titan in the gloom, carrying the forest on his back. He felt a sense of satisfaction in the simple, brutal labor. But as the dust settled, the silence of the woods pressed in on him. It was too quiet. The singing of the spring that Hylas had spoken of was distant, but there was no sound of footsteps returning. "Hylas," Hercules called out. The name was swallowed by the trees, absorbed by the moss. There was no answer. The unease returned, sharp and cold, seizing the hero's heart with a grip tighter than any wrestler. He turned back toward the direction the boy had gone, the heavy pines still on his shoulder, and began to walk, his pace quickening with every step. The oar was forgotten, the water was forgotten. The world walker moved into the dark, seeking the one thing in the world he could not bear to lose. Chapter 18. The forest of Mysia was a realm apart, a pocket of silence tucked away from the roar of the sea and the clamor of the heroes. While Hercules wrestled with the earth to harvest a pine tree, his squire Hylas followed a delicate ribbon of mist that wound its way through the ferns. Hylas was young, his beard barely a shadow upon his jaw, possessing a beauty that seemed almost out of place among the scarred and weathered Argonauts. He carried a pitcher of beaten bronze, a heavy vessel that clinked softly against his thigh with every step, the sound ringing like a small bell in the deepening twilight. He was thirsty, and the promise of the spring drew him onward. The air grew cooler here, heavy with the scent of damp moss and blooming nightshade. The trees, ancient sentinels with roots like gnarled knuckles, seemed to lean in as he passed, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind. Hylas did not fear the dark. He walked in the shadow of the strongest man in the world, and that protection had always felt absolute. He hummed a low tune, a song from his childhood, unaware that he was stepping across a threshold from the mortal world into the domain of the unseen. The spring, when he found it, was a perfect circle of obsidian water, framed by white stones that glowed under the rising moon. This was the Peggy, a sacred wellspring that fed the life of the forest. The water was so still it acted as a mirror for the heavens, capturing the first stars of the evening in its dark depths. It did not look like water. It looked like a portal to the night sky. Hylas knelt at the edge, placing his hands on the cool stones. He leaned forward, his reflection rising to meet him, a face of innocence and grace, framed by curls of golden hair. But as he gazed into the pool, other faces appeared beside his own. They were not reflections. They looked up from the bottom of the spring, their eyes wide and luminous, their skin the color of pale moonlight. The naiads of the spring, Eunica, Mollies, and Nichia, had been dancing in the deep currents when the youth approached. They were creatures of liquid emotion, ancient and ageless, bound to the water as the stars are bound to the sky. They had seen many things come to their pool: deer, wolves, rough men with calloused hands and hearts of stone. But they had never seen anything like Hylas. To them, he was a revelation, a creature of such radiant beauty that he seemed to burn with an inner fire. He was the sun come down to drink, and a sudden, overpowering covetousness seized their immortal hearts. They did not want to hurt him. They wanted to possess him. They wanted to keep him in the cool, timeless dark of the water, preserved forever like a jewel in amber. Hylas, unaware of the eyes watching him from the deep, lowered the bronze pitcher. The metal broke the surface tension with a soft bloop, sending ripples outward that shattered the reflection of the moon. The water rushed into the vessel, heavy and cold. As the pitcher filled, Hylas prepared to lift it, but the weight was suddenly greater than it should have been. He frowned, bracing his arm, and looked down. A hand had broken the surface. It was slender, wet, and impossibly pale. It grasped his wrist, not with the grip of a monster, but with the gentle, insistent touch of a lover. Then another hand appeared, and another, rising from the water like lilies blooming in fast motion. Hylas gasped, his heart hammering against his ribs. He tried to pull back, but the strength of the naiads was the strength of the tide, relentless and fluid. "Who?" he stammered, his voice trembling. The nymphs rose from the water, their forms shimmering with droplets that looked like diamonds. They smiled, a terrible, beatific expression of adoration. One of them, Eunica, reached up and cupped his cheek, her touch as cold as ice. She did not speak, for her voice was the sound of the bubbling spring, but her intent was clear. "Stay," her eyes seemed to say. "Stay where the world cannot aid you. Stay where there is no pain, no labor, only the song of the water." Hylas panicked. The spell of their beauty broke under the primal fear of suffocation. He planted his feet and pulled, straining against the delicate arms that held him fast. But he was a boy, and they were the daughters of the earth. With a collective sigh that rustled the reeds, the nymphs leaned back, using the weight of the water to their advantage. Hylas lost his footing on the slick moss. The bronze pitcher slipped from his fingers, sinking into the black depths with a hollow glug. He fell forward, his arms flailing, splashing into the embrace of the Peggy. The cold shock of immersion took his breath away. He opened his mouth to scream, to call out the one name that had always been his salvation. Hercules. The cry tore from his throat, a jagged sound of terror that echoed through the silent trees. But as the water filled his mouth, and the soft, strong arms of the naiads pulled him down into the weeds and the dark, the sound was cut short. The surface of the pool churned violently for a moment, froth and bubbles breaking the stillness. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The ripples faded. The reflection of the moon reassembled itself on the black glass of the water. The woods returned to their heavy silence, indifferent to the theft. Hylas was gone, taken not by death, but by a love too deep and too selfish for the world of men to understand. On the bank, only the scuff marks of his sandals in the mud remained to prove he had ever been there at all. Chapter 19. Polyphemus, the son of Elatus and brother-in-arms to the greatest heroes of the age, stood on a high ridge overlooking the darkening valleys of Mysia. He had not gone to the ship, nor had he followed the main hunting party deep into the interior. A sense of unease, carried on the cooling twilight air, had kept him vigilant near the perimeter. The woods were too quiet, the shadows too long, and the ancient trees seemed to hold their breath. He leaned on his spear, his ears straining against the silence, waiting for the crack of a twig or the call of a nightjar to break the stillness. Instead, he heard a scream. It was faint, filtered through the density of the heavy canopy and the damp moss, but it carried a pitch of pure, unadulterated terror. It was not the cry of a man in battle, nor the shout of a hunter spotting prey. It was the desperate, pleading wail of a boy facing the unknown. Hercules. The name was a prayer and a goodbye, cut short as if severed by a blade. It echoed once, faint and high, before being swallowed by the vast indifference of the forest. Polyphemus froze, his blood running cold in his veins. He knew that voice. It was Hylas, the golden youth, the bearer of the hero's armor and the keeper of his heart. Without hesitation, Polyphemus abandoned his post. He drew his sword, though he knew not what enemy he fought, and plunged into the undergrowth, sprinting back toward the coast where he had last seen the demigod. He did not run to the spring. He ran to the only force on earth capable of answering such a call. He found Hercules emerging from a ravine, a titan silhouetted against the rising moon. The world walker carried a pine tree upon his shoulder, an entire tree, root, ball, and all, torn from the earth to serve as an oar for the Argo. He looked like a god of the wild, untroubled and invincible, a man who bent the world to his needs. "Hercules," Polyphemus shouted, breathless and wild-eyed, waving his arms to catch the giant's attention. "Drop the wood." I heard a cry. It was Hylas. He called your name and then silence. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The massive pine tree, a burden that would have crushed a team of oxen, fell from Hercules' shoulder as if it were a stalk of wheat. It crashed to the ground, shaking the earth and sending a cloud of dust into the night air. But Hercules did not even look at it. The calm dominance that defined the hero evaporated in a single heartbeat, replaced by a frenzy that was more frightening than the rage of the Nemean lion. Where? Hercules roared, the sound scattering the roosting birds from the canopy. To the east, near the Peggy, Hercules did not wait for further direction. He turned and launched himself into the forest. He did not seek a path, he made one. The thickets of briar and thorn that would have flayed a normal man were brushed aside like cobwebs. Saplings snapped like dry twigs against his chest as he barreled through them. He moved with a speed that defied his mass, a golden blur of panic tearing through the night. Hylas, the name ripped from his throat, a raw, jagged sound that echoed off the valley walls. It was a roar of grief before the loss was even confirmed, a preemptive mourning that spoke of a deep, unhealed wound in the hero's soul. He had saved the world from monsters. He had wrestled death itself, but he could not save his family from madness. And now, the terror that he could not save this boy from the dark seized him with icy claws. He reached the vicinity of the spring, but the forest was dense and confusing in the moonlight. The panic blinded him. He began to run in widening circles, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a struggle. Hylas, answer me. There was no answer. Only the wind moving through the pines and the distant, mocking hoot of an owl. The silence was a physical weight, heavier than the sky he had once held. The impotence of his strength drove him to madness. He needed to fight something, to crush a skull or strangle a beast, but there was no enemy to fight. The enemy was the silence. The enemy was the empty woods. In his fury, Hercules grabbed a centuries-old oak that blocked his view. He roared, his muscles swelling to the point of bursting, and ripped the tree from the soil, roots screaming as they gave up their hold. He hurled it aside, seeking a view, seeking a sign, seeking anything. He tore through the landscape like a bull stung by a gadfly. He overturned boulders, smashed through groves of olive trees, and trampled the delicate ferns into the mud. The wildlife of Mysia fled in terror, not from a hunter, but from a protector turned destroyer. The demigod was unraveling. Polyphemus, following in the wake of destruction, found Hercules kneeling in a clearing, his chest heaving, sweat dripping from his beard. The hero was trembling, his great hands clawing at the earth. He looked up, his eyes wide and wet, filled with a devastation that no weapon could inflict. "He is gone," Hercules whispered, the realization settling over him like a shroud. The earth has swallowed him. He stood up, and for the first time in his life, he looked small. The mighty club lay forgotten in the grass. The bow remained unstrung. All the power of Olympus, all the strength that had bested the Hydra, was useless here. It could break stone and bend iron, but it could not reach into the other world. It could not pull a boy back from the invisible embrace of the water. Hercules threw his head back and let out a howl of despair that silenced the night, a sound so full of pain that even the stars seemed to shiver. The world walker had stopped walking. He was lost in the woods of Mysia, and the path forward had vanished with the boy. Chapter 20. The dawn did not bring hope to the coast of Mysia. It brought only a cruel and insistent wind. It was a gale that blew from the west, the kind of wind that sailors pray to the gods for, a steady, driving force that promised to carry the Argo swiftly toward the Propontis. But on the deck of the speaking ship, The mood was not one of anticipation, but of frantic debate. The sun had crested the eastern ridges, painting the sea in hues of bruised purple and gold. And still, the stroke bench remained empty. Tiphys, the master navigator, stood at the helm, his knuckles white as he gripped the tiller. He looked at the sky, then at the water, reading the currents with a desperate urgency. "The tide turns, Jason," he cried, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crew. "And the wind is a gift we dare not squander. If we do not sail now, we may be trapped in these calm waters for a month. The favor of the gods is not an infinite well." Jason stood at the prow, torn between his honor and his ambition. He looked toward the dense green wall of the forest, where Hercules and Polyphemus had vanished the night before. The silence from the woods was absolute. There was no sign of the lion skin, no earth-shaking tread of the world walker. "He has abandoned us," muttered Zetes, one of the winged sons of the north wind. He and his brother Calais were eager to be away, for they had always resented the shadow Hercules cast over the rest of the crew. "He has run mad with grief for the boy. Are we to jeopardize the quest for the Golden Fleece because one man has lost his wits? He is the strongest of us," Telamon argued, though his voice lacked conviction. "To leave him is to leave our shield." "He is a storm," Jason decided, his face hardening as he made the choice that would haunt him for the rest of his days. And storms are dangerous to ships. We are 50 heroes, not one. The quest is greater than the man. Tiphys loosed the sheet, cast off the lines. The order was given. The Argo, sensing the freedom of the open water, leaped forward as the sail caught the gale. The heroes worked in a sullen silence, refusing to meet each other's eyes. They knew they were committing a betrayal, leaving the greatest among them stranded on a savage shore. But the pull of destiny and the fear of failure were stronger than the bonds of brotherhood. The ship cut through the waves, a white bird fleeing the scene of a crime, and soon the coast of Mysia was nothing but a dark line on the horizon. Hours later, the forest spat Hercules back out onto the beach. He was a ruin of a man. His tunic was torn by briars, his skin scratched and mudded, his beard matted with the sap of the trees he had wrestled in his frenzy. He walked with a heavy, stumbling gait, his great club dragging in the sand behind him. His voice was gone, reduced to a rasping whisper after a night of screaming the name of the lost boy. He had searched every ravine, every glade, every stream, but Hylas was gone, taken by the spirits of the place, leaving not even a footprint behind. Hercules stepped onto the white pebbles of the shore, his eyes adjusting to the glare of the morning sun. He looked toward the cove where the Argo had been beached. He blinked, thinking his mind was finally playing the tricks he had feared. He rubbed his eyes with dirty knuckles and looked again. The cove was empty. The sand was churned where 50 men had pushed a heavy keel into the surf. The ashes of the campfire were cold and scattered by the wind, but the ship, the vessel he had carried on his back, the crew he had protected with his life, was gone. Hercules dropped his club. He walked to the edge of the water, the surf lapping over his sandals. He scanned the horizon, his keen eyes piercing the distance. There, far to the north, a tiny speck of white against the blue. A sail, a vanishing hope. He did not roar. He did not rage. The anger that had fueled him in the forest had burned itself out, leaving only a hollow, echoing chamber in his chest. He stood motionless as the realization washed over him. He had been cast aside. The heroes of the age, the princes he had called brothers, had weighed his worth against a favorable wind and found him wanting. He was no longer an Argonaut. The fleece was not his to find. For a long time, the world walker stared at the empty sea, the salt spray drying on his face. Then, slowly, he turned his back on the water. The ocean was a fickle mistress, ruled by chaotic gods and sailed by treacherous men. But the earth was solid. The earth endured. Hercules bent down and picked up his club. He adjusted the Nemean lion's skin on his shoulders, the golden jaws settling around his head like a helmet of resolve. He looked not north toward the fleece, but east, toward the rising sun and the distant towers of Troy. He was alone again, a solitary pilgrim on the road of trials. Eurystheus still held his leash, and new labors awaited. With a heavy sigh that sounded like the closing of a great door, Hercules began to walk, his shadow stretching out before him, leading him away from the sea and into the dust of a new destiny. Chapter 21. The wake of the Argo had long since faded from the surface of the sea, and with it, the last tether binding Hercules to the fellowship of men. He stood for a time on the high cliffs of Mysia, watching the horizon where the ship had vanished, a solitary figure etched against the vast, indifferent sky. The grief for Hylas was a stone in his chest, heavy and cold, but the betrayal of Jason was a fire that cauterized the wound. He had been the shield of the expedition, the breaker of oars and the slayer of giants, yet they had left him for the sake of a favorable wind. The lesson was bitter, but it was learned. A hero of the gods walks alone. Hercules turned his back on the wine-dark sea. He adjusted the Nemean lion's skin, the golden jaws settling over his head like a helm of resolve, and gripped his olive-wood club. The road did not end because the ship had sailed. The road merely changed its nature. The world walker began to move, his stride eating the miles with a relentless, rhythmic cadence that would carry him across the spine of the world. He marched east, plunging into the heart of the Anatolian hinterland. The landscape shifted from the lush coastal forests to the arid, wind-scoured plains, where the sun beat down with the weight of a hammer. He slept under the stars, eating what he could hunt, drinking from mountain streams that tasted of snow and iron. In the villages he passed, he was a terrifying apparition, a giant clad in the skin of a beast, speaking a dialect of Greek that sounded like grinding stones. They gave him bread and cheese, pointing him toward the rising sun with trembling fingers, whispering of the lands beyond the known map. Eurystheus, safe in his bronze jar in Mycenae, had commanded this journey. The king's daughter, Admete, had heard tales of the golden girdle worn by Hippolyta, the queen of the Amazons. It was a belt of war, a gift from Ares himself, signifying sovereignty and martial prowess. Admete coveted it as a trinket, a piece of vanity to wear at court. For the whim of a spoiled princess, Hercules was forced to traverse a continent and confront a nation of warriors who had never known the yoke of men. The journey was a labor in itself, a test of endurance that stripped away the softness of the Argos camaraderie. Hercules crossed the raging Halys River, wading chest-deep against the current. He climbed the Pontic Mountains, where the air was thin and the eagles circled below him. He walked until the soles of his sandals wore through, and his feet became as hard as the hooves of a centaur. Weeks turned into months, until finally the air changed. The scent of pine and dust was replaced by the smell of wet earth and thousands of horses. He had reached the banks of the Thermodon River, a waterway that carved through the plain of Themyscira like a serpent. Here, the world was ordered differently. There were no shepherds tending sheep, no farmers pushing plows. The fields were training grounds. In the distance, Hercules saw them, riders moving in perfect unison, their silhouettes cutting sharp shapes against the twilight. They were the Amazons, the daughters of Ares. They rode not with the chaotic fervor of the Thracians, but with a disciplined grace that was terrifying to behold. They wore tunics of embroidered leather and carried crescent-shaped shields, their hair braided tight to keep it from the bowstring. Hercules stopped at the edge of the river, looking across to the city of Themyscira. It was not a place of luxury like the palaces of Crete, nor a trap of seduction like the island of Lemnos. It was a fortress. The walls were high and patrolled by sentinels who watched the approaches with the eyes of hawks. The architecture was stark and functional, built for defense and war. He felt a strange sense of respect stirring within him. On Lemnos, the women had killed their men in a fit of madness and then languished in the silence. Here, the women had built a civilization on the edge of the blade. They did not need men to protect them. They were the wolves of their own borders. Hercules waded into the Thermodon, the water swirling around his waist. He did not draw his weapon. He did not roar or posture. He came not as an invader, for a single man does not invade an empire, but as an ambassador of his own legend. He walked toward the gates of the Amazon capital, a lone male in a matriarchy of steel, driven by the pettiness of a king, but sustained by his own indomitable will. The sorrow of Hylas and the sting of the Argo were behind him now. Ahead lay the Queen of War, and the world walker would meet her gaze without blinking. Chapter 22. The gates of Themyscira did not creak with rust, nor did they groan with the weight of neglect. They swung open with the silent, oiled precision of a well-maintained machine of war. Hercules stood at the threshold, the dust of a continent clinging to his lion's skin, his hands empty of weapons. He had left his great club leaning against the outer wall, a gesture of peace that spoke louder than any herald's trumpet. Flanking the entrance were the guards of the Amazonian capital, women tall as saplings and hard as ironwood, their eyes tracking the hero not with fear, but with the cool, predatory assessment of apex hunters. They saw the muscles that coiled beneath his skin like pythons, and they saw the scars that mapped a history of violence. Yet they did not strike. They recognized a fellow creature of the battlefield. Hercules walked through the streets of the city. It was a place of stark, terrifying beauty. There were no marketplaces filled with idle chatter, no temples to the softer gods of wine and harvest. Every square was a training ground. He saw archers loosing arrows into targets, so distant they were mere specks. He saw riders practicing maneuvers that turned horses into extensions of their own bodies. The air rang with the clash of bronze and the sharp commands of drill instructors. It was a symphony of discipline, and for the first time in many months, the chaos in Hercules' heart quieted. Here was order. Here was purpose. He was led to the central citadel, an open-air pavilion supported by columns of red stone. At the center, seated not on a throne of gold, but on a simple bench of carved oak, waited Queen Hippolyta. She was a vision of martial perfection. Her armor was not ceremonial. It was dented and scratched, the gear of a woman who led from the front. Her hair was dark as a raven's wing, braided back to reveal a face that was both beautiful and severe. Around her waist, gleaming with an inner light that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of Ares himself, was the golden girdle. It was a belt of thick, woven gold, inlaid with rubies that looked like drops of fresh blood. It was the symbol of her sovereignty, the gift of the war god to his favored daughter. Hercules stopped before her and bowed his head, a mark of respect from one demigod to another. The court fell silent, the Amazonian captains watching with hands resting on the hilts of their swords. "You are the world walker," Hippolyta said, her voice clear and resonant, "the one who strangled the Nemean lion and held the sky upon his shoulders. Why does a man who rivals the gods come to my city without a sword? Hercules met her gaze evenly. Because I have seen enough war, queen of the Amazons. I have left a trail of blood from Mycenae to the Propontis. I did not wish to stain your stones with more. Hippolyta leaned forward, intrigued. Then what do you seek? A challenge? A bride? I seek a trinket, Hercules admitted, his voice tinged with a weary self-deprecation. The king of Mycenae, Eurystheus, has a daughter. She desires your girdle. She wishes to hold the favor of Ares in her hands, though she has never lifted a spear. I am bound by the oracle to serve this king, and so I am bound to ask for it. A murmur of indignation rippled through the assembled warriors. To ask for the queen's symbol of power for a spoiled child was an insult worthy of death. Hands tightened on weapons. But Hippolyta raised a hand, silencing her sisters. She looked at Hercules, really looked at him, and saw the profound exhaustion behind his eyes. She saw a man who was stronger than the world, yet enslaved by duty. She saw the tragedy of his existence, a god in shackles. And if I refuse? Hippolyta asked softly. Then I must take it, Hercules replied simply, without threat or malice. And I would mourn the necessity of it. The queen stood up. She walked down the steps of the dais, approaching the giant until she stood within arm's reach. She looked at the Nemean hide, at the calloused hands that had reshaped geography. She saw a mirror of her own strength, trapped in a different cage. You are an honest monster, Hercules, she said, a faint smile touching her lips. The world fears us both. It calls us unnatural because we do not fit into the small boxes men build for their lives. I will not fight you for a piece of gold, no matter who forged it. My power does not reside in a belt. It resides in my blood and in the sisters who stand beside me. With a fluid motion, Hippolyta reached to her waist. She unbuckled the heavy golden clasp. The girdle of Ares came free in her hands, heavy and radiant. The Amazons gasped, shocked by the surrender. But Hippolyta's gaze never wavered from the hero's face. Take it, she said, holding it out. Tell your king that the queen of the Amazons gave it freely, not out of fear, but out of respect for the burden you carry. Let the child play with her toy. We know where the true strength lies. Hercules took the girdle. The metal was warm from her skin. He looked at it, then back at the queen, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. For the first time in his labors, he had been met not with treachery or madness, but with wisdom. You honor me, Queen Hippolyta, Hercules said, bowing low. And you shame those who sent me. I simply recognize a fellow traveler, she replied. Come, world walker. The sun is high. Let us break bread and drink wine. Tonight, you are not a servant. You are a guest of Themyscira. For a few brief hours, under the golden light of the afternoon sun, peace reigned on the banks of the Thermodon. Two legends sat side by side, sharing stories of the edges of the world, unaware that in the shadows of the sky, the queen of the gods was already plotting to turn their harmony into a massacre. Chapter 23. High above the mortal plain, where the air is thin and the stars burn with a cold, indifferent light, the queen of Olympus looked down upon the banks of the Thermodon River. Hera, the sister and wife of Zeus, watched the scene unfolding below with a gaze that could wither vineyards and turn oceans to ice. She saw the peaceful exchange between the son of her husband's infidelity and the queen of the Amazons. She saw the wine being poured and the bread being broken. She saw the golden girdle of Ares, the object of the quest, lying freely given on the table between them. This harmony was an insult more galling than any battle. Hera had not orchestrated the life of Hercules to see him feted as a diplomat. She had birthed monsters to break him, sent madness to plague him, and set kings to enslave him. To see him succeed through grace rather than suffer through toil was a bitterness she could not swallow. The script of the hero's tragedy required blood, and if the mortals would not spill it themselves, the goddess would guide their hands. With a movement that rippled the clouds like a stone cast into a pond, Hera descended. She did not come in her chariot of peacocks, nor in her raiment of starlight. She stripped away her divine radiance, cloaking the blinding majesty of her true form in the dust and grit of the earth. When her feet touched the soil of Themyscira, she was no longer the queen of heaven. She was merely a woman, clad in the leather armor of an Amazon warrior, her face obscured by the shadow of a bronze helmet, her eyes burning with a terrestrial fierceness. She moved among the ranks of the Amazon guard, who stood at a respectful distance from the royal pavilion. These women were disciplined and loyal, watching their queen converse with the giant stranger. They were wary, for they knew the nature of men, but they trusted Hippolyta's judgment. The atmosphere was tense but controlled, a bowstring drawn but not loosed. Hera began to weave her poison. She slipped through the crowd like a viper in tall grass, appearing first at one campfire, then another. She did not shout, she whispered. Her voice was a low hiss, mimicking the anxieties that already lay dormant in the warriors' hearts. "Do you see how close he sits?" she murmured to a captain of the archers. "He does not look at the belt, he looks at the queen." To a spearwoman, she whispered, "Why did he leave his club at the gate? Because he does not need wood to take what he wants. He waits for her to lower her guard. The ship is waiting in the harbor. Do you think a son of Zeus crossed the world for a piece of jewelry?" The lies were simple, crafted with the infinite psychological insight of a deity who had spent eons manipulating the hearts of mortals. She played upon their fierce love for their sister queen, twisting their loyalty into paranoia. She painted Hercules not as a weary traveler, but as a cunning abductor, a beast who used soft words to entrap his prey before dragging her back to Greece in chains. "He means to take her," the disguised goddess hissed, her voice trembling with feigned outrage. "He means to break our circle. He will steal Hippolyta and make her a slave in the house of Eurystheus. Will you stand and watch while the stranger puts a collar on the daughter of Ares?" The ripple of unease turned into a wave of panic. The Amazons looked toward the pavilion, their perspective warping under the influence of the divine lie. They no longer saw a shared meal. They saw a trap snapping shut. When Hercules laughed at a story Hippolyta told, they heard the gloating of a captor. When Hippolyta handed him a cup of wine, they saw a victim unaware of her doom. The whisper spread like wildfire in a drought-stricken forest. It jumped from mind to mind, growing hotter and more volatile with every repetition. "He is kidnapping her. The Greeks are treacherous. To arms, to arms." The discipline of Themyscira began to fracture. The silence of the afternoon was broken by the ominous sound of swords, sliding from scabbards and shields, being lifted from the grass. The calm, rhythmic breathing of the army shifted into the jagged, heavy panting of a predator ready to spring. Hera, seeing her work take root, dissolved into the shadows, leaving behind a harvest of fury. At the royal table, Hercules paused, the cup of wine halfway to his lips. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, a primal warning system honed by years of surviving the impossible. He lowered the cup, his eyes darting away from the queen to the lines of warriors in the distance. The air had changed. The scent of ozone and adrenaline washed over the pavilion, drowning out the smell of the river. "Something is wrong," Hercules said, his voice dropping to a rumble. Hippolyta turned, her brow furrowing in confusion. She saw her sisters mounting their horses, their faces twisted masks of rage and fear. She saw the bows being raised, the arrows notched with lethal intent. She opened her mouth to shout a command, to restore order, but the roar of the collective panic was already too loud. The whisper of Hera had become a scream, and the tragedy of the Amazons was about to be written in blood. Chapter 24. The peace of the afternoon shattered like a clay pot dropped on stone. The first warning was the thundering of hooves, a rhythmic drumming that rose from the earth and vibrated through the soles of Hercules' sandals. He looked up from the table where the wine still rippled in the cups, his senses sharpening instantly from the haze of diplomacy to the clarity of war. Across the plain of Themyscira, the Amazon cavalry was charging. They came in a wave of bronze and leather, their crescent shields flashing in the sun, their war cries tearing the air apart. Treachery, Hercules roared, the word tasting of ash and betrayal. He turned his gaze to Queen Hippolyta. A moment ago, she had been a kindred spirit, a fellow traveler in the lonely realm of legends. Now, in the face of the charging horde, she looked to him like the architect of a trap. The world walker had been fooled by kings, cheated by gods, and abandoned by friends. The scar tissue of his trust was thin, and under the sudden, violent pressure of the attack, it tore open completely. He did not see the confusion on Hippolyta's face, the way she stood with her hands raised in a desperate attempt to halt her sisters. He saw only the ambush. "You speak of honor," Hercules growled, his voice a low rumble that drowned out the approaching thunder, "while you signal the slaughter." Hippolyta reached out, her eyes wide with shock. "Hercules, no, it is a mistake. I did not," but the time for words had been stolen by the lies of Hera. An arrow whistled past the hero's ear, thudding into the wooden post of the pavilion. The instinct for survival, honed in the swamps of Lerna and the forests of Nemea, took over. Hercules did not wait to be surrounded. He moved with a speed that defied his size, a blur of golden pelt and terrifying kinetic energy. He drew his sword, the blade singing as it left the scabbard. Hippolyta, realizing too late that the beast she had tamed with kindness had been startled back into ferocity, reached for her own weapon to defend herself. The movement was defensive, but to Hercules, it was the final confirmation of her deceit. The clash was brief and tragic. The queen of the Amazons, the daughter of Ares, was a warrior of supreme skill, but she was mortal. Hercules was an elemental force. He deflected her strike with a wrist of iron and drove his own blade forward. The steel pierced the leather of her breastplate, finding the heart that had, only moments before, offered him friendship. Hippolyta fell. The light went out of her eyes before she hit the ground, her hands still reaching toward him, not in attack, but in a silent plea for understanding. Silence seemed to expand from her fallen form, a shockwave of horror that momentarily stunned the battlefield. But then the screams of the Amazons redoubled, fueled now by grief and a thirst for vengeance. They crashed into the pavilion, a storm of blades and fury. Hercules fought his way out. He snatched the golden girdle from the body of the queen, the blood-red rubies now slick with the real thing. He did not look back at the woman he had killed. He became the monster they believed him to be, a whirlwind of destruction that carved a path through the elite guard. He reached the gates where his club waited, reclaiming the weapon that never lied to him. With the girdle clenched in his fist and his heart frozen in a block of ice, Hercules retreated to the river. He waded through the Thermodon, the water turning pink around him, and marched back to the coast where a small merchant vessel waited to take him west. He boarded the ship in silence, casting off the lines himself. As the sails caught the wind and the coast of Themyscira receded into the haze, Hercules sat on the deck, staring at the prize in his hands. The girdle of Ares gleamed in the sunlight, a thing of exquisite beauty and infinite worth. But to the hero, it felt heavier than the sky. He had completed the labor. He had served the will of Eurystheus, but he had paid for it with the murder of one of the few souls on earth who might have understood him. The whisper of Hera had done its work. The world walker was alone once more, carrying a trophy that would forever smell of regret. Chapter 25. The voyage west from the mouth of the Thermodon was a somber passage. The ship cutting through the gray waters of the Euxine Sea like a hearse bearing a silent mourner. Hercules sat at the stern, the chest containing the golden girdle of Hippolyta at his feet. The prize was won, but the cost was etched into the lines of his face, a map of sorrow that deepened with every league traveled. He had sailed to the Amazons as an ambassador and fled as a butcher, the victim of a divine whisper that turned friendship into slaughter. Now, seeking only the path back to Mycenae to deliver his blood-soaked tribute, fate, or perhaps the cruel winds of Hera, steered him toward the Hellespont and the shores of the Troad. As the ship navigated the narrow straits that separated Europe from Asia, a sight of breathtaking majesty rose from the windy plains to the south. It was a city of gold and white stone, perched upon a hill that commanded the land and the sea. This was Troy, the jewel of Ilium, a fortress whose walls were the stuff of legend. They rose sheer and seamless, defying the logic of masonry, for they had not been raised by the sweat of slaves. In a time before, when the gods walked closer to the earth, Poseidon the earth-shaker and Apollo, the far-shooter, had built these ramparts as a labor of penance, their divine hands stacking the Cyclopean stones that no army could breach. But as Hercules drew closer, the grandeur of the city was overshadowed by a palpable aura of dread. The great gates, the Scaean gates, were barred and bolted with iron. The harbor, usually a bustling nexus of trade, where ships from Crete and Phoenicia exchanged copper for textiles, was desolate. Ships rotted at their moorings, their sails furled and gray with mildew. There was no smoke rising from the sacrificial fires, no clamor of the marketplace, no laughter of children playing in the surf. The city held its breath, frozen in a collective paralysis of terror. Hercules made landfall on the deserted beach, the sand crunching beneath his sandals like the bones of small birds. He walked past the empty warehouses and the silent cranes, sensing the presence of a threat that was not of this world. The air smelled of salt, yes, but beneath it lay the cloying, rotten stench of stale water and ancient decay, the scent of the deep abyss brought up to the light of day. He found King Laomedon not on his throne, surrounded by sycophants, but standing alone on the highest rampart of the seaward wall. The king was an old man, wrapped in robes of purple that hung loosely on his gaunt frame. His crown seemed too heavy for his head, and his eyes were fixed on the horizon with the hopeless stare of a condemned prisoner. Laomedon was a man who had built his kingdom on deceit. He had refused to pay the gods the wages promised for the building of his walls, and now the debt collectors had come. "You look upon a dead city, stranger," Laomedon rasped, his voice carried away by the wind without turning to face the hero. "The walls are strong. They can hold back the armies of the Hittites and the Achaeans, but they cannot hold back the sea." Hercules stepped up beside the king, his massive presence dwarfing the monarch. He looked out at the water, which churned with an unnatural turbulence. Far out in the bay, a shadow moved beneath the surface, a dark, serpentine shape that eclipsed the whales in size and malice. It was the Cetus, a monster sent by Poseidon to ravage the coast, a living plague that demanded a terrible tax. Poseidon is a harsh creditor, Hercules said, his voice a low rumble. I see his mark upon the water. Laomedon turned then, his face a mask of anguish and greed. He demands payment, not gold nor cattle. He demands flesh. Every day the beast rises, and every day we tremble. The oracle has spoken the final price, but I cannot pay it. I cannot. The king's hands shook as he gripped the stone parapet. He was a man who had hoarded his wealth and cheated the divine architects, and in his avarice, he had doomed his people. The monster did not merely kill, it blighted the land with its breath, turning the fertile plains into salt marshes. The silence of Troy was the silence of a people waiting for the inevitable end, ruled by a king who was paralyzed by the consequences of his own hubris. Hercules looked at the pathetic figure of Laomedon, then back to the dark shape, prowling the deep water. He felt a stir of the old fire in his gut. He was tired of tragedy, tired of the intricate webs of guilt and punishment woven by the Olympians. Here was a problem that could not be solved with words or negotiations. Here was a monster that needed killing. Fear creates its own prisons. King of Troy, Hercules stated, resting his hand on the hilt of his sword. You have walls that can stop an army, but you lack the will to fight the tide. I have fought the sea before. I have ridden its bulls and crossed its cups. If the gods have sent a beast to collect a debt, perhaps it is time someone renegotiated the terms. Chapter 26. The path from the high citadel of Troy down to the jagged teeth of the coastline was a road paved with the salt of tears. Hercules walked it alone, the king Laomedon having retreated into the safety of his palace, unable to witness the grim necessity his own greed had wrought. The wind coming off the Aegean was biting and cold, carrying the metallic tang of the coming storm. It whipped the hero's lion-skin cloak around his legs, but he moved with the implacable momentum of a glacier, drawn by a sight that boiled the blood in his veins. At the edge of the water, where the waves crashed with violent, frothing fury against black volcanic rock, a single figure stood chained to the cliff face. It was not a criminal, nor a prisoner of war. It was a girl, barely out of childhood, dressed in the tattered remnants of a royal gown. This was Hesione, the daughter of the king, the final payment on a debt she did not owe. Hercules approached slowly, his boots crunching on the wet shingle. Hesione hung from bronze shackles that were bolted deep into the stone, her arms stretched wide in a cruel parody of an embrace. Her head hung low, her dark hair plastered to her face by the sea spray. She did not weep. She had passed beyond the realm of tears into the cold, numb country of despair. She was a statue of resignation, a sacrificial lamb waiting for the butcher's blade. "Princess," Hercules said, his voice soft yet audible over the roar of the surf. Hesione lifted her head. Her eyes were hollow, reflecting the gray turbulence of the sea. She looked at the giant man standing before her, at the golden pelt and the massive club, and a flicker of confusion crossed her face. "Have you come to watch?" she whispered, her voice cracked and dry. "My father watches from the high tower. The people watch from the walls. Everyone watches, but no one moves." "I am not here to watch," Hercules replied, stepping closer. He reached out and touched the cold iron of her chains. They were forged by master smiths, designed to hold fast against the thrashing of a victim, but to the world walker, they were merely metal. "I am here to break the cycle." "You cannot," she said, a shudder running through her frail frame. The oracle spoke. "Poseidon demands royal blood to wash away the plague. If I am not eaten, the monster will swallow the city whole. My death buys them life." Hercules looked into her eyes and saw the terrifying logic of sacrifice that ruled the ancient world. It was a logic of fear, a belief that the gods could be bribed with the suffering of the innocent. He hated it. He hated it with the same fury that had driven him to strangle the snakes in his cradle. "The gods do not need your blood, Hesione," Hercules rumbled, his anger directed not at her, but at the empty sky and the treacherous king. "They need only to be reminded that mortals are not cattle to be slaughtered for their amusement. Your father built walls to keep out men, but he offers his own daughter to the beast. That is not a king, that is a coward." The water in the bay began to churn. A dark shape rose from the depths, displacing the waves. The Cetus was coming. It was a nightmare of scales and teeth, a leviathan that blotted out the light. The smell of rot intensified, rolling over the beach in a suffocating cloud. Hesione gasped, her body pressing back against the unforgiving rock, her eyes wide with the primal terror of the prey. "Leave me," she screamed, the fear finally breaking her numbness. "Run, stranger. It will kill you too." Hercules did not run. He turned his back to the girl and faced the sea. He planted his feet wide on the slippery rocks, grounding himself like a mountain. He unslung his club and rested it on his shoulder, a casual gesture of defiance in the face of oblivion. "Let it come," Hercules said, his voice calm and steady as the earth itself. "I have wrestled death before, and I found it wanting. Close your eyes, princess. Do not open them until you hear the silence." He stood as a barrier between the girl and the abyss, a lone figure against the might of the ocean. In that moment, he was not just a warrior. He was a rejection of the cruel fate that demanded the weak be devoured by the strong. He was the world walker, and he would not let the innocent perish while he still had breath in his lungs. Chapter 27. The sea did not merely rise, it erupted. The surface of the bay, gray and churning under the storm clouds, bulged upward as if a mountain were being born from the deep. From this liquid mountain emerged the Cetus, a creature that belonged to an older, darker epoch of the world. Its head was a crag of barnacle-encrusted bone and green scales, massive enough to swallow a trireme whole. Its eyes burned with a bioluminescent malice, twin lanterns of doom in the gloom of the Troad. Water cascaded from its flanks in waterfalls, and its roar was a physical force, a sonic boom that shook the dust from the walls of Troy and rattled the chains of the terrified princess. Hercules stood firm on the slick black rocks, a speck of golden defiance against the towering monstrosity. He did not retreat. He did not pray. He watched the beast with the cold calculation of a master hunter, assessing the thickness of the hide, the speed of the strike, the rhythm of the monster's breathing. The Cetus lunged. It moved with terrifying speed for something so vast, its jaws gaping wide to reveal rows of serrated teeth, each the size of a man. It aimed not for the hero, but for the girl chained to the cliff, the sacrifice it had been promised. "Not today," Hercules bellowed, his voice cutting through the roar of the surf. He did not dodge. He ran. He sprinted toward the edge of the rock shelf and launched himself into the air, a golden missile flying straight into the face of death. He did not strike at the armored snout or the impenetrable scales of the neck. He aimed for the only vulnerability the beast exposed in its arrogance, the open maw. Hercules vanished into the darkness of the monster's throat. For a moment, there was silence. The Cetus snapped its jaws shut, splashing back into the water with a tidal crash that swamped the beach. Hesione screamed, a sound of pure despair, believing her savior had been devoured in a single bite. The king on the high wall turned away, unable to watch the end. But the beast did not submerge. It thrashed. The water around it began to boil and froth. A muffled, rhythmic pounding echoed from inside the creature, like the beating of a giant, angry heart. The Cetus roared, but the sound was choked, gurgling with black ichor. Inside the humid, reeking cavern of the monster's throat, Hercules was at work. He braced his feet against the ridges of the gullet and swung his sword, a blade forged of iron and intent, with relentless fury. He carved through the soft tissue, severing the great arteries that pulsed with the lifeblood of the abyss. He was suffocating in the heat and the stench, sliding in the muck, but he did not stop. He was the cancer in the beast, the indigestion of the gods. With a final, desperate heave, the Cetus threw its head back, opening its jaws in a silent scream of agony. Hercules seized the opportunity. He scrambled up the slick tongue, leaping past the rows of teeth, and burst back into the air, covered in slime and blood, roaring his triumph to the sky. He landed on the monster's snout, balancing precariously on the shifting scales. He raised his olive-wood club, which he had strapped to his back, and brought it down with the force of a meteor strike. Crack! The sound was sickeningly loud, the shattering of bone that signaled the end. The light in the monster's eyes flickered and died. The massive body went limp, crashing into the shallow water with a final, shuddering impact that sent a wave washing over the hero's feet. Hercules stood atop the fallen Leviathan, chest heaving, the rain washing the gore from his skin. He looked back at the cliff. Hesione was staring at him, her mouth agape, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. She had expected a sacrifice. She had witnessed a miracle. He leaped from the carcass to the rocks and walked to the girl. With two swift jerks of his immense hands, he tore the bronze shackles from the stone, shattering the chains that bound her. He caught her as she collapsed, her legs too weak to hold her. "The debt is paid," Hercules said, his voice rough but gentle. "Not with your blood, but with his." He looked up at the walls of Troy, where the people were beginning to cheer, their voices thin and distant against the wind. The sea was calm again, the monster a broken island of flesh in the surf. Troy was saved, but as Hercules looked toward the palace, his eyes narrowed. The beast was dead, but the man who had fed it was still alive, and the world walker had little patience for kings who broke their oaths. Chapter 28. The gates of Troy stood open now, no longer barred by fear, but thrown wide in a celebration that felt brittle as dried leaves. Hercules marched through the Scaean gate, leading the rescued Princess Hesione by the hand. The people of the city, starved for hope, lined the streets, cheering the stranger who had done what their gods had not. They threw flowers, wilted things, scavenged from neglected gardens at his feet, and reached out to touch the hem of his lion-skin cloak. But Hercules did not smile. His eyes were fixed on the palace at the top of the hill, where the king waited. He entered the throne room, a vast chamber of polished marble and gold leaf that smelled of incense and hypocrisy. King Diomedes sat on his throne, his fear replaced by the arrogant relief of a man who has escaped the gallows through another's effort. He looked at his daughter, alive and whole, and nodded once, a gesture devoid of fatherly warmth. "You have done well, stranger," Diomedes said, his voice smooth and dismissive. "The beast is dead. The city is safe. You have my thanks." "I did not do it for your thanks," Hercules replied, his voice echoing in the silent hall. He released Hesione's hand, and she hurried to the side, casting a fearful glance back at her savior. "We had a bargain, King of Troy. The life of your daughter and the safety of your city for the horses of the sun." the immortal steeds given to your grandfather Tros by Zeus himself. I have kept my word. Now keep yours." Laomedon laughed. It was a dry, scratching sound, like sand rubbing against stone. He leaned forward, looking down at the hero with a sneer. "The horses. You think I would give the divine stallions to a wandering vagabond, a mercenary covered in muck and blood? Those horses are the pride of Ilium. They are fit only for kings, not for muscle-bound laborers who do dirty work for coin." The insult hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. The courtiers held their breath, sensing the shift in the room's energy. Hercules stood very still. The rage that had been a constant companion since the death of Hylas flared hot in his chest. But he did not roar. He did not draw his sword. This was not a moment for a brawl. It was a moment for judgment. "You are a fool, Laomedon," Hercules said quietly, his voice vibrating with a dangerous intensity. "You cheated Poseidon and Apollo, and they sent a monster to eat your children. Now you cheat the son of Zeus. Do you think your walls will save you from me? My walls were built by gods." Laomedon shouted, standing up, his face flushing with anger. "Get out of my city. Take your club and your lion's skin and go back to the mud you crawled from. You will get nothing from me but your life if you leave now." Hercules looked at the king, etching the man's face into his memory. He saw the rot in Laomedon's soul, the same rot that had infested Augeas and Diomedes. It was the arrogance of power without honor. "I will leave," Hercules declared, turning his back on the throne. "But hear this oath, King of Troy, I will return, not alone and not as a savior. I will come with an army of heroes. I will shatter your gates, I will topple your towers, and I will leave not one stone standing upon another. You have kept your horses, but you have sold your city." He walked out of the palace, the silence of the court ringing in his ears. He marched back down the hill, ignoring the confused pleas of the citizens, who did not understand why their hero was leaving empty-handed. He boarded his ship, casting off the lines with a grim finality. As the vessel pulled away from the harbor, Hercules looked back at the shining walls of Troy. He did not see a fortress, he saw a tomb. The debt was unpaid, but the world walker never forgot a promise. The war for Troy had not begun with a golden apple. It had begun here with a broken word. And when Hercules returned, he would bring the thunder of Olympus with him. Chapter 29. The journey back from Troy was a silent one, the hero's heart heavy with the accumulated betrayals of kings. Hercules returned to the Peloponnese, not to the fanfare of trumpets, but to the quiet solitude of the Arcadian hills. He sought peace in the wild places, far from the courts of men who broke their oaths as easily as they broke bread. He camped in a high valley where the air smelled of pine resin, and the only sound was the wind rushing through the gorges. Here he hoped to rest, to let the calluses on his soul heal, just as the scars on his skin had done. But peace is a luxury denied to the son of Zeus. It began with the sky. The stars, usually fixed in their eternal dance, began to tremble. The constellations shifted, their light flickering as if blown by a cosmic gale. The moon turned the color of bruised copper, casting a sickly, reddish light over the mountains. Then came the sound, a low, grinding vibration that rose from the very bones of the earth. A deep resonance that shook the leaves from the trees and sent the wolves running for their dens. Hercules stood by his campfire, his hand instinctively reaching for his club. He looked up, expecting a storm, but he saw something far more terrifying. A chariot descended from the heavens, its wheels striking sparks against the clouds. It was driven by Hermes, the messenger of the gods, his winged sandals blurring with speed. He landed in the clearing with a grace that belied the urgency etched into his immortal features. "Son of Zeus," Hermes said, his voice stripped of its usual wit and mischief. "Put on your skin, take up your bow. The time of rest is over. I have no quarrel with Olympus," Hercules grumbled, turning back to the fire. "I have served my time. I have fetched belts and cleaned stables. Leave me be, herald. This is not a labor for Eurystheus," Hermes replied, stepping closer, the caduceus in his hand glowing with a desperate light. "This is for existence itself. The earthborn have risen. The gigantes, the sons of Gaia, born from the blood of Uranus. They are storming the mountain. They are piling Pelion upon Ossa to scale the heights of Olympus. They mean to tear the king of the gods from his throne." Hercules scoffed, poking the embers with a stick. "Let the gods fight their own wars. They have lightning and tridents. What need have they of a mortal with a stick?" Hermes grabbed the hero's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Listen to me, brother. The fates have spun a thread that cannot be cut by divine hands alone. There is a prophecy, ancient and binding. The gods cannot kill the giants. We can strike them down, we can burn them, we can crush them, but we cannot end them. Only a mortal hand can deal the death blow. Without you, Olympus falls. Without you, the order of the world crumbles into chaos, and the age of monsters returns." Hercules looked into the eyes of the messenger and saw real fear. The Olympians, those distant, arrogant beings who had toyed with his life, were now begging for his salvation. It was a delicious irony, but one that tasted of ash. If the gods fell, the world would indeed return to darkness. The people, the innocent, the weak, the forgotten, would be the first to suffer under the rule of the giants. "They ask for my help," Hercules asked quietly. "After Hera's madness, after the years of torment, they do not ask," Hermes said, looking at the red moon. "They pray. Zeus himself calls for you. Athena waits with her chariot. Will you let the world burn for the sake of your pride?" Hercules sighed, a sound like a crumbling mountain. He kicked dirt over his fire, extinguishing the small comfort he had made for himself. He picked up the Nemean lion's skin and draped it over his shoulders, the familiar weight settling like armor. He strung his great bow, testing the tension of the yew wood. "Very well," Hercules said, stepping toward the divine chariot. "Take me to the war. But tell Zeus this, I do not fight for his throne. I fight so that the sun will rise tomorrow for the men who till the earth." Hermes nodded, relief flooding his face. "Get in. The Phlegrean fields await, and the battle has already begun." The chariot launched into the sky, leaving the quiet hills of Arcadia behind. As they ascended, the air grew cold and thin, filled with the roar of thunder and the screams of immortal combat. Hercules stood tall in the carriage, watching the horizon burn, ready to step onto the stage of the gods and prove, once and for all, that the strength of humanity was the hinge upon which the universe turned. Chapter 30. The chariot of Hermes did not simply fly. It tore through the veil that separated the mortal world from the divine. The wheels spun with a light so intense it seared the retina, carrying Hercules upward through layers of cloud and atmosphere, until the very air tasted of ozone and ambrosia. Below them, the familiar geography of Greece, the patchwork of olive groves, and the jagged coastline shrank to the size of a child's map. Ahead, the destination was not a place of peace, but a crucible of fire. The Phlegrean fields, the burning lands, lay spread out beneath the roots of Mount Olympus. It was a landscape of nightmare, a volcanic plain where the Earth's crust was thin and the magma of Tartarus bubbled close to the surface. But today, the geological violence was dwarfed by the clash of titans. The sky above the fields was a canvas of apocalyptic fury. Lightning bolts, thick as ancient oaks and blindingly white, hammered down from the peaks of Olympus, shattering against shields of obsidian and bedrock. As the chariot descended, Hercules gripped the rail, his eyes widening. He had fought monsters. He had wrestled the Nemean lion and slain the Hydra. But this was war on a scale that defied comprehension. The gigantes were not merely large men. They were mountains given form and malice. Their legs were writhing serpents, their hair a tangle of vipers, and their skin was the color of granite. They stood waist-deep in the smoking craters of their own making, hurling entire peaks at the cloud-shrouded summit of the gods. Hercules watched as a boulder, the size of a city block, arced through the air, trailing smoke, only to be disintegrated by a trident blast of pure azure energy. "Behold the enemy," Hermes shouted over the din, his voice thin against the roar of battle. "Alcyoneus, the bane of Hades, Porphyrion, the king of giants. They do not tire, Hercules, they do not fear, and they do not die." Hercules saw the Olympians, beings he had only ever imagined as distant, luminous concepts, now fighting in the mud and the ash. He saw Ares, the god of war, his bronze armor dented and smoking, being driven back by a giant wielding a cypress tree as a club. He saw Artemis, her silver bow flashing, raining arrows that pierced the giants' hides, but failed to stop their advance. He saw Apollo, radiant and terrible, blinded by a cloud of ash thrown by Ephialtes. Even Poseidon, the earthshaker, seemed small against the sheer, brute mass of the earthborn. The gods were losing. It was a terrifying realization. The beings who governed the tides and the seasons, who held the threads of fate, were pinned down, their divine ichor staining the blackened soil. They were immortal, yes, but they were not invincible. They were being overwhelmed by the raw, chaotic power of the primal earth. "They need more than lightning," Hercules murmured, his hand tightening on his bow. "They need blood. They need a finisher," Hermes corrected, banking the chariot hard to avoid a flying crag of burning rock. "They can break the body, but the spark of life remains. The prophecy says only a mortal can extinguish it. You are that mortal, Hercules. You are the blade in the hand of the divine." The chariot touched down on a ridge overlooking the carnage. The heat was intense, singing the hair on Hercules' arms. The smell was a mix of sulfur, ozone, and the coppery tang of god blood. Hercules stepped out, his feet sinking into the hot ash. He felt small here, a speck of dust in a hurricane of immortals. But then he remembered who he was. He was the man who had held up the sky. He was the man who had walked into the mouth of a sea monster and walked out again. He unslung his bow, the wood groaning as he tested the string. He reached into his quiver and pulled out an arrow, its tip dipped in the venom of the Hydra, the one poison that even the earth could not heal. "Where is the king?" Hercules asked, his voice steady. Hermes pointed to the center of the battlefield, where the lightning was thickest. "Zeus fights Alcyoneus. Go, brother. Show them what a son of Alcmena can do." Hercules nodded. He did not run, he stalked. He moved down the ridge and into the fray, a lion entering a den of wolves. The World Walker had arrived at the end of the world, and for the first time in history, the gods looked down not with judgment, but with hope. Chapter 31. The battlefield was a cacophony of divine violence, a place where the air itself screamed under the impact of energies that could shatter worlds. Hercules moved through the chaos, a solitary figure of flesh and blood amidst the clash of immortals. His target was the heart of the storm, Alcyoneus, the bane of Hades, the mightiest of the earthborn. Alcyoneus was a nightmare carved from the bedrock of the Phlegrean fields. He towered over the fray, his skin the texture of cooling lava, his eyes burning with the sullen red hate of the deep earth. In his hands, he wielded a massive club of ironstone, smashing aside the attacks of the gods with contemptuous ease. Zeus himself hurled thunderbolts from the high ridges, searing arcs of white fire that struck the giant's chest with the force of falling stars. The strikes would have vaporized a city, but on Alcyoneus, they merely blackened his rocky hide. Where the flesh was torn, the earth beneath his feet seemed to pulse, sending a surge of vitality upward through his legs. The wounds knitted shut in seconds, leaving not even a scar. Hercules watched, his tactical mind dissecting the impossibility before him. He saw the pattern. The giant was not merely strong, he was connected. He was an extension of the land he stood upon, drawing infinite regeneration from his mother, Gaia, as long as his feet touched the soil of his birth. You cannot kill the mountain by striking the peak. Hercules shouted to himself, his voice lost in the roar of battle. He nocked an arrow, the tip glistening with the dark, viscous venom of the hydra. He drew the great yew bough to its limit and loosed. The shaft flew true, burying itself deep in the giant's throat. Alcyoneus roared, clutching at the arrow, stumbling back as the poison coursed through his veins. For a moment, he faltered, but then the golden glow of the earth rose up his legs, purging the toxin, sealing the puncture. The giant laughed, a sound like a landslide, and turned his gaze toward the tiny mortal who dared to sting him. "You are a gnat," Alcyoneus rumbled, swinging his ironstone club. "I am the earth itself." Hercules dodged the blow, the wind of the passing weapon nearly knocking him from his feet. He knew he could not win a contest of strength here. He had to change the rules. He had to move the mountain. He sheathed his sword and dropped his bow. He charged the giant, not to strike, but to grapple. He ducked under a clumsy backhand swing and slammed into the giant's legs. Hercules wrapped his arms around the massive, tree-trunk ankles of the foe. He roared, summoning every ounce of power he possessed, the strength that had held the heavens, the strength that had strangled the lion. Up, Hercules bellowed, his veins bulging like ropes against his skin. With a heave that cracked the bedrock beneath him, Hercules lifted Alcyoneus. The giant's feet left the ground. Instantly, the golden glow of regeneration flickered and died. Alcyoneus thrashed, realizing his peril, but Hercules held fast. He was not just lifting a body, he was uprooting a force of nature. Hercules did not stop. He began to run, carrying the struggling behemoth on his shoulders. He ran away from the center of the Phlegrean fields, away from the volcanic soil that gave the giant his power. He ran toward the border of the land, where the dark earth of the fields gave way to the gray stone of the neighboring territory. The giant pounded on Hercules' back, blows that would have pulverized a lesser man, but the Nemean lion's skin absorbed the worst of it. Hercules gritted his teeth, his vision blurring with exertion, but he did not falter. He crossed the invisible line where the magic of Pelion ended. With a final, explosive effort, Hercules hurled Alcyoneus to the ground. The giant landed hard, the earth here cold and unresponsive to his touch. He tried to rise, but the wounds from the battle, the burns of Zeus, the cuts of Ares, suddenly flared with real, unhealing pain. He was mortal now. Hercules stood over him, chest heaving, sweat dripping from his brow. He retrieved his bow from where he had dropped it, knocking another hydra-poisoned arrow. "The earth cannot save you here," Hercules said, his voice grim. He loosed the arrow. It struck Alcyoneus in the heart. This time, there was no golden glow. The poison did its work. The light in the giant's eyes faded, turning to the dull gray of dead stone. The bane of Hades was no more. Hercules looked back toward the battle, where the gods still fought, and knew the tide had turned. The impossible foe was dead, and the World Walker had proven that even the children of the earth could be broken if you knew where to stand. Chapter 32. The death of Alcyoneus sent a shockwave through the ranks of the giants, but it did not break their fury. If anything, it sharpened it. Porphyrion, the king of the giants, roared a challenge that shook the very foundations of Olympus. He was a creature of immense stature, larger even than his fallen brother, clad in armor forged from the plates of the earth's crust. His eyes burned with a chaotic madness, fueled not by strategy, but by a primal lust for destruction. Seeing the tide turn against his kin, he fixed his gaze on the highest prize on the battlefield, Hera, the queen of the gods. Hera stood near the edge of the conflict, her divine radiance dimmed by the smoke and ash. She was isolated, separated from Zeus by a wall of lesser giants. Porphyrion saw her vulnerability. With a stride that crossed valleys in a single step, he charged. He did not raise his weapon to strike. He reached out with a hand the size of a chariot, his intent clear and vile. He sought to tear the veil of her divinity, to humiliate the Queen of Heaven, and through her, break the spirit of the Olympians. Hera, for all her power, froze. The sheer, overwhelming malice of the earthborn king was a force she had never encountered. She raised her hands to summon a shield of air, but Porphyrion shattered it with a casual backhand, his laughter booming like thunder in a canyon. He loomed over her, his shadow blotting out the burning sky. Hercules, watching from the ridge where he had slain Alcyoneus, saw the danger. A bitter irony twisted in his gut. Here was the woman who had sent serpents to his cradle, who had driven him mad, who had whispered the lies that killed Hippolyta. Every tragedy in his life, every scar on his soul, bore her fingerprint. To let her fall would be justice. It would be the sweetest vengeance a mortal could taste. But Hercules was not just a man of vengeance. He was a protector of the order of the world. If Hera fell, Olympus would falter. If the gods broke, chaos would reign. He looked at the queen, seeing not the tormentor, but a terrified entity facing oblivion. "Curse you," Hercules gritted out, his voice low and heavy with resignation. He nocked an arrow. At that same instant, the clouds above tore open. Zeus, seeing the peril of his wife, unleashed the full wrath of the sky. A thunderbolt of pure, blinding white fire descended, striking Porphyrion squarely in the chest. The impact was cataclysmic. The giant was thrown backward, his armor fusing to his skin, his roar turning into a scream of agony. He crashed to his knees, smoke rising from his scorched flesh, stunned but not dead. The divine fire had broken his attack, but it had not extinguished his life. "Now, son," Zeus bellowed from the heavens, his voice cracking with urgency. Hercules drew the string to his ear. He aimed not with hate, but with duty. He released the shaft. The arrow, tipped with the Hydra's blood, sang through the chaotic air. It was a line of death drawn between the mortal hero and the immortal enemy. It struck Porphyrion in the eye, driving deep into the brain. The king of the giants stiffened. The madness in his gaze flickered and went out. He toppled forward, crashing to the earth with a sound that signaled the end of the war. Silence fell over the Phlegrean fields. The remaining giants, seeing their kings dead, faltered and were swiftly cut down by the rallying gods. Hercules lowered his bow, his chest heaving. He looked across the battlefield to where Hera stood. She was pale, her composure shaken, staring at the dead monster at her feet. Slowly, She lifted her eyes and met the gaze of the stepson she had tormented for a lifetime. There were no words of apology, no embrace of forgiveness. Such things were not the way of the gods. But in her eyes, Hercules saw a flicker of something new, a grudging, cold respect. He had saved her life. He had held the line when the heavens could not. Hercules turned away, shouldering his bow. The war was won. The prophecy was fulfilled. But as he walked through the smoke, leaving the gods to celebrate their victory, he knew his own road was not yet finished. The west was calling, and the edge of the world still waited. Chapter 33. The victory on the Phlegrean fields had earned Hercules the gratitude of Zeus, but it had bought him no respite from the malice of Eurystheus. The king of Mycenae, terrified by the hero's growing legend and emboldened by Hera's silent prodding, devised a labor meant to send his cousin off the map entirely. The 10th labor was not merely difficult, it was a journey into the void. Hercules was commanded to fetch the red cattle of Geryon, a monster who lived on the island of Erythea, far in the unknown west, where the sun went to die each evening. Hercules left the smoking battlegrounds of Greece and walked into the silence of Africa. He traversed the great deserts of Libya, a land where the earth was reduced to its most elemental form: wind, sand, and fire. For weeks he marched through a furnace. The sun here was not the benevolent patron of the harvest. It was a tyrant, a white-hot eye that scoured the land of life. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the hero's shoulders, heavier than the sky he had once held. There was no water, save for the bitter drops he could wring from the roots of withered scrub brush. There was no shade, only the blinding glare of the dunes that stretched to infinity. Yet Hercules walked on. His skin darkened to the color of polished mahogany. His beard grew wild and bleached by the sun. And his eyes took on the distant, focused look of a man who has left humanity behind. He fought not monsters, but the limits of his own endurance. He wrestled with thirst, with hallucination, with the despair that whispers in the empty places of the world. Finally, the landscape began to change. The sand gave way to rock, jagged and red, rising like the spine of a buried dragon. The air grew cooler, carrying a scent that Hercules had not smelled in months, the salt of the deep ocean. He crested a final ridge and looked down. Before him lay the end of the world. He stood at the narrow strait where the familiar blue of the Mediterranean Sea met the dark, turbulent gray of the Atlantic Ocean. This was the boundary of the known. To the ancients, this was the edge of reality, the point where the map simply stopped. On one side lay the coast of Europe, rugged and green; on the other, the stark cliffs of Africa. Between them, the water churned with dangerous currents, marking the gateway to the outer dark. Hercules descended to the shore. The waves here were different, larger, heavier, crashing with a sound like thunder. He looked out at the vast expanse of the Atlantic. Somewhere out there, in the mists of the sunset, lay the island of Erythea. But there was no ship to take him, no bridge to cross. He was a man of the earth standing at the precipice of the infinite water. Frustration, hot and sudden, welled up in him. He had walked across a continent, endured the furnace of the desert, and fought the wars of gods, only to be stopped by geography. In a fit of temper, Hercules drew his sword and struck the rock of the cliff face. He did not chip it, he cleaved it. He struck again and again, channeling his exhaustion and his rage into the stone. He tore 2 massive crags from the mountain range, shaping them with his bare hands, piling rock upon rock, until 2 great pillars stood on either side of the strait. He named them the Pillars of Hercules, monuments to his journey, warnings to sailors, and a gateway for the brave. They stood as sentinels at the end of the earth, marking the point of no return. As he finished his work, the sun began to set. But it did not dip gently below the horizon. It blazed with an unbearable intensity, the god Helios driving his golden chariot close to the surface of the ocean. The heat returned, searing the hero's skin. Hercules, pushed past the breaking point, did the unthinkable. He unslung his bow, nocked an arrow, and aimed it straight at the sun. Back, Hercules roared at the sky, his voice cracking with thirst. "Give me shade, or I will strike you from the heavens." The audacity of the threat silenced the wind. Helios, the titan of the sun, checked his horses. He looked down at the mortal who dared to threaten a star. Instead of anger, the god felt a surge of amusement and respect. Here was a spirit that could not be cowed, a man who would fight the sun itself rather than yield. Helios descended, not to burn, but to parley. The heat lessened, replaced by a warm, golden glow. The god offered Hercules a gift, not a weapon, but a vessel. It was a massive golden cup, the very boat in which the sun sailed back to the east each night via the ocean river. "You have spirit, little ant," Helios's voice boomed, warm as a summer noon. "Take my cup. Cross the dark water. But know this, the monsters at the edge of the world are not like the ones you know. They are older and they are hungry." Hercules lowered his bow. He stepped into the golden cup, which bobbed gently on the turbulent surf. He sat down, his club across his knees, and let the current take him. He was leaving the world of men behind, sailing into the sunset, toward the red cattle and the three-bodied terror that guarded them. The pillars faded into the mist behind him, the last landmarks of home. Chapter 34. The golden cup of Helios skimmed across the surface of the great ocean like a leaf caught in a gentle breeze. Yet it moved with the inexorable speed of the sun's own passage. Hercules sat within its curved hull, his massive frame dwarfed by the divine vessel. The heat of the African desert was a fading memory, replaced by the cool, misty breath of the Atlantic. Here, the water was not the familiar turquoise of the Aegean, but a deep, slate gray that seemed to swallow the light. The sky hung low and heavy, a canvas of bruised clouds that mirrored the hero's weary soul. Ahead, the island of Erythea emerged from the fog. It was a desolate rock, battered by the ceaseless waves of the outer sea. The grass was red, stained by the iron in the soil, or perhaps by the blood of those foolish enough to venture this far west. Upon the rolling hills, a vast herd grazed. These were the cattle of Geryon, beasts of such unnatural beauty that they glowed with a ruby inner light. Their coats were the color of sunset, their horns polished ivory. They moved in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, watched over by a two-headed dog and a giant herdsman. Hercules stepped from the cup onto the black sand of the beach. He did not announce his arrival. The sound of his boots on the gravel was enough to alert the guardians of the herd. Orthrus, the brother of Cerberus, was the first to attack. The beast was a nightmare of muscle and fur, its two heads snarling in dissonance, saliva dripping from jowls that could crush stone. It charged with the speed of a pouncing panther. Hercules met the rush without flinching. He swung his olive-wood club in a low arc, a blur of motion that connected with the creature's skulls. There was a sickening crunch, and the hound fell silent, its threat extinguished before it could truly begin. Next came Eurytion, the herdsman. He was a giant of a man, though small compared to the titans Hercules had fought on the Phlegrean fields. He wielded a staff of knotted oak and fought with the desperation of a servant terrified of his master. Hercules dispatched him with a single, regretful blow. He had no quarrel with the shepherd, but the path to the cattle had to be cleared. Then the earth trembled. From the high fortress in the center of the island, Geryon emerged. He was the reason this labor was deemed impossible. Geryon was not one man, but 3 bodies joined at the waist. He had 6 legs, 6 arms, and 3 heads, each helmeted in bronze. He was a phalanx of 1, a walking army capable of attacking from all angles simultaneously. He carried 3 shields, 3 spears, and wore 3 sets of armor. His roar was a chorus of rage, 3 voices screaming in unison. "Thief!" Geryon bellowed, his 6 arms raising weapons in a terrifying display of coordination. "You come to steal the sun's cattle? You will feed the crabs of the ocean floor." Hercules stood his ground, knocking an arrow to his great bow. He knew he could not fight Geryon in close quarters. The flurry of spears would overwhelm even his defenses. He had to be surgical. He had to be the archer who had brought down the Stymphalian birds. He waited. Geryon charged, a clanking, stomping juggernaut of bronze and flesh. The ground shook with each of his 6 footfalls. He was a wall of death closing in fast. Hercules drew the string to his cheek. He breathed out, slowing his heart, finding the stillness within the chaos. He aimed not at the chests, but at the point where the 3 bodies converged, the single, vulnerable axis of the monster's existence. Thrum! The arrow flew. It was a shot that defied physics, guided by the hand of a master and the will of a hero who refused to fail. The shaft pierced the side of the first body, passed through the second, and buried itself in the third. The Hydra's venom, potent and immediate, flooded the giant's shared circulatory system. Geryon stumbled. The 3 heads looked at each other in confusion, then in pain. The 6 arms went limp, the spears clattering to the rocks. The monster fell, a tangled heap of limbs and metal, silencing the red island. Hercules lowered his bow. He walked past the fallen titan to the herd. The ruby cattle looked at him with large, indifferent eyes. He began to herd them toward the golden cup, his 10th labor complete. But as he looked back at the carnage on the beach, he felt no triumph. He was simply a man doing a job, wading through blood to satisfy the whim of a king who sat safe in a palace, while the world walker stood alone at the edge of the earth, surrounded by the dead. Chapter 35. The work of the pillars was done, the great rocks torn asunder to mark the boundary of the known world. But the labor of the hero was far from finished. Hercules stood upon the burning sands of the Libyan coast, the sweat evaporating from his skin before it could even bead. The air shimmered with a heat so intense it distorted the horizon, turning the meeting point of sea and sky into a wavering, liquid haze. This was not merely the warmth of summer. It was the fury of the zenith, a relentless bombardment of solar fire that sought to cook the marrow within the bone. Hercules had endured the frozen winds of Thrace and the suffocating mists of the Stymphalian marsh. But this silence, the roaring, white-hot silence of the African noon, was a different kind of torture. The Nemean lion's skin, his constant armor and companion, felt heavier than a leaden shroud. His throat was parched, coated with the dust of the desert, and his patience, already frayed by the endless cruelty of Eurystheus, finally snapped. He looked up. The sun hung directly overhead, a blinding disk of tyranny. It was Helios, the titan who drove the chariot of the day, looking down upon the world with an unblinking, searing gaze. To any other man, the sun was a god to be worshipped, a force of life to be feared. But Hercules was past fear. He was past reverence. He was a man pushed to the absolute limit of his endurance, standing at the edge of the earth where the rules of civilization dissolved. With a growl that rumbled deep in his chest, Hercules unslung his massive bow. He planted his feet in the scorching sand, ignoring the burn against his soles. He reached into his quiver and drew an arrow, not a common shaft, but one tipped with the dark, necrotic venom of the Hydra. He knocked the arrow, his muscles coiling like steel cables as he drew the heavy yew wood back to his ear. He aimed straight at the sun. Back, Hercules roared, his voice cracking the superheated air. "Veil your face, Lord of the Noon, or I will strike you from the heavens. I am Hercules, and I walk where I please, but I will not be burned like a sacrifice on your altar." It was an act of supreme madness. To threaten a god was hubris. To threaten the sun was insanity. Yet the arrow held steady, pointed at the heart of the star. High above, in the golden chariot that traversed the firmament, Helios pulled back on the reins of his fire-breathing steeds. The Titan looked down, expecting to see a worshipper cowering in the dust. Instead, he saw a lone figure, a speck of defiance standing against the infinite power of the cosmos. Helios saw the tension in the bow, the lethal glint of the Hydra's blood on the arrowhead, and the utter, terrifying resolve in the hero's eyes. For the first time in eons, the sun god laughed. It was not a sound of mockery, but of genuine delight. The gods of Olympus were used to groveling and fear. Here was a mortal who possessed the spirit of the ancient Titans, a creature of such indomitable will that he would declare war on the sky itself rather than suffer discomfort. The heat began to abate. The blinding glare softened into a warm, golden luminescence. A voice, vast and resonant as a solar flare, descended from the clouds. "Put down your bow, world walker," Helios commanded, his tone laced with mirth. "I have seen many things from my high seat, but never a man with the gall to hunt the sun. You have a fire in you that rivals my own." Hercules slowly lowered the weapon, though he did not unstring it. "I seek passage," he grumbled, wiping the sweat from his eyes. "The ocean is wide, and the island of Erythea lies beyond the sunset. I have no ship." "Then you shall have mine," Helios declared. From the shimmering waves of the western horizon, a wonder approached. It was a vessel of colossal size, shaped like a great drinking cup, forged from pure, beaten gold. It was the craft Helios used to sail the subterranean river of Oceanus back to the east each night, a divine ferry that moved without oars or sails. It floated toward the shore, glowing with an inner light that turned the sea to molten bronze. "Take the cup," Helios said. "It will carry you across the dark waters where no wooden ship dares to go. But be warned, son of Zeus, the edge of the world is a place of monsters, and the shadows grow long where the sun goes to sleep." Hercules waded into the surf, the water hissing against the hot metal of the vessel. He climbed over the rim and settled into the hollow of the cup. It rocked gently, buoyant, and impossible. As he sat there, the golden walls reflecting the sky, Hercules felt a strange sense of peace. He had challenged the highest power he could see, and he had been met with respect. The cup began to move, propelled by the divine will of the Titan. It surged away from the pillars, cutting through the heavy swells of the Atlantic. Hercules watched the coast of Africa fade into the haze, his face set toward the west. He was sailing into the unknown, carried in the cradle of the sun, toward the red island and the three-bodied giant who waited in the gloom. The heat was gone, but the darkness was just beginning. Chapter 36. The golden cup of Helios, vast and buoyant as a ship of the gods, grounded gently upon the dark shingle of Erythea. The island lay shrouded in a perpetual, bloody twilight, situated so far to the west that the sun seemed to pause and bleed into the ocean before sinking into the underworld. Here the grass was not green, but a deep, rusted crimson, and the air tasted of copper and ancient dust. Hercules stepped from the divine vessel, his boots sinking into the black sand. He was no longer the brash youth seeking glory, nor the penitent servant seeking absolution. He was the world walker, a man who had traversed the spine of the earth, endured the furnace of the desert, and sailed the forbidden waters of the outer ocean. He moved with the heavy, inevitable momentum of a storm front. Before him, grazing upon the red hills, were the cattle of Geryon. They were beasts of unearthly beauty, their hides the color of a dying ember, their horns curved and sharp as crescent moons. But they were not unguarded. From the shadows of a rocky outcrop, a low, dissonant growl vibrated through the air. Orthrus, the two-headed hound, emerged. He was the brother of Cerberus, a monster of muscle and hate, with eyes that burned like coals in his twin skulls. He did not bark, he launched himself at the intruder, a blur of teeth and fury. Hercules did not break stride. He swung his olive-wood club, the weapon that had been his companion since Nemea, in a tight, brutal arc. The blow connected with a sound like cracking thunder. Orthrus fell mid-leap, his threat extinguished before it could fully scream. Behind the dog came Eurytion, the giant herdsman, wielding a staff of ironwood and shouting curses in a forgotten tongue. He fought with the desperate loyalty of a servant who fears his master more than death. Hercules parried the giant's strike with his forearm, protected by the invulnerable lion skin, and delivered a single, silencing blow to the chest. The herdsman collapsed into the red grass, joining the hound in the quiet of the end of the world. Then the earth shook. From the fortress of obsidian that crowned the island's peak, Geryon descended. He was a biological impossibility, a terror of the ancient world. 3 bodies grew from a single pair of massive legs, 3 torsos fused at the waist, 6 arms wielding 6 weapons, and 3 helmeted heads that looked upon the world with a singular, unified malice. He was a phalanx of one, a walking army clad in triple bronze armor. Thief, Geryon roared, his 3 voices overlapping in a terrifying chorus. You slay my servants? You seek to rob the sunset. I will grind your bones to dust and scatter them on the tide. Hercules stood his ground, watching the monster approach. He saw the tactical nightmare before him. To engage Geryon in close quarters was suicide. 6 arms against 2 was a math that favored the giant. The World Walker knew that strength alone was not enough. He needed the precision of the architect, the eye of the hunter. He unslung his great bow, the wood groaning under the tension as he drew it. He reached into his quiver and selected a single arrow, its tip stained dark with the venom of the hydra, the blood of a monster to kill a monster. He did not aim for the heads, which were shielded by helms and moving with erratic rage. He did not aim for the chests, covered in thick bronze plates. Hercules waited. He stood motionless as the triple-bodied titan charged, the ground trembling, the spears raised to impale him. He waited until Geryon turned slightly to bring his shields to bear, aligning his 3 torsos in a momentary, fatal geometry. Now Hercules loosed the arrow. It sang through the heavy air, a whisper of death. It struck the side of Geryon's rightmost flank, piercing the armor as if it were parchment. Driven by the immense draw weight of the hero's bow, the shaft passed through the first body, punched through the second, and buried itself deep in the third. The hydra's poison, potent enough to kill the earth itself, flooded the giant's shared heart in an instant. Geryon halted, his charge arrested as if he had hit a wall. The 3 heads looked at one another in confusion, then in agony. The 6 arms went limp, the spears and shields clattering onto the red stones. With a groan that sounded like a collapsing mountain, the king of Earthea, fell. The dust settled, leaving only the sound of the wind and the restless lowing of the red cattle. Hercules lowered his bow. He walked to the fallen Titan, retrieving his arrow with a grim grimace. He had done it. He had walked to the edge of the map, faced the horrors of the unknown, and prevailed. He turned to the herd, driving the crimson beasts toward the golden cup of Helios. As he pushed off from the shore, leaving the silent, red island behind, Hercules looked back at the pillars he had raised in the east. He was a hero who had expanded the boundaries of the world, a mortal who had walked where gods feared to tread. The impossible labors were done, but the long road home still stretched across the sea, and the world walker knew that the hardest journey is always the return. We have watched the son of Zeus transcend the boundaries of myth and reality, carving a path across the infinite stars as the legendary world walker. His labors have reshaped the cosmos, proving that true strength lies not just in muscle, but in the will to bridge the gaps between worlds. If you possessed the divine power of Hercules and the ability to step between dimensions, which realm from history or fiction would you choose to explore first? Let us know in the comments below, for we are eager to hear where your imagination takes you. If this grand odyssey stirred your spirit, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and hype this story so we can continue to bring these epic legends to life for you. Your support ensures the fires of our storytelling never fade. We hope you journey back soon to the Midnight Oasis. Thank you.